Chapter 796. A little earlier, Ning Ke left the Spring Breeze Pavilion Chow Mansion and walked towards the Vermilion Bird Avenue, leaving behind the worried Zheng Jing and his wife and old Chow, who acted as if nothing had happened. Chow Xiaoshu left Chang'an with Lu Vi and the cavalry of the Valiant Cavalry Battalion. However, the Chow Mansion was still bustling with people. That was because countless government decrees were issued through this mansion to various markets in the city. Moreover, dozens of refugees had been taken in, so the Chow Mansion had not been quiet these days. Today the Chow Mansion was very quiet. Since early morning, the servants and refugees in the mansion had heard many deafening sounds and the big movements coming from the city. People first heard the ringing of bells throughout the city, followed by the sound of wind and knives, followed by thunder, snow, rain, and explosions until they saw the burning snow clouds in the sky. Fear gradually grew because no one knew what had happened. When Ning Ke came and left, they knew that the battle did not belong to the human world, so they became more and more confused and cold. There were officials of the imperial court in the Chow Mansion, refugees avoiding the battle, and brave members of the Fish Dragon Gang, but they were all ordinary people who were not qualified to join the battle. The courtyard was shrouded in a long period of silence. The refugees held their children nervously, afraid that they would make any noise. Old Chow and Zheng Jing and his wife sat at the table with different expressions on their faces. Eventually, someone would not be able to bear it. The first person who stood out did not exceed old Chow's expectations. He looked at him and said, "You should know very well that you will die if you go." Mr. Qi replied, "Ba, when have you ever seen me afraid of death?" Qin 7, who had been standing quietly by the window, turned around and looked at his fourth brother. He frowned slightly, showing that he did not agree. He was about to say something to stop him, but old Chow waved his hand. "If you want to go, then go. Do you need an old man like me to agree to something like this?" Mr. Qi smiled, turned around and walked out of the Chow Mansion with dozens of members of the Tsingyi gang. Qin 7 said after a moment of silence, "There is no point." Old Chow knew what he was talking about. The battle happening on the Vermilion Bird Avenue had already gone beyond the scope of the 5 states and could not be affected by secular forces. The Academy could not defeat the powerful enemy. Even if the Fish Dragon Gang or even the entire Chang'an were to die, there was no way to stop the enemy. People always need to be helped or want to be helped. Old Master Chow said, "Although Mr. 13 isn't an ordinary person like us, I think he also hopes that we, the people of Chang'an, can help him." Qin Chi said, "If the help doesn't work, then it's meaningless. Even if the Abbey Dean is really an immortal and only needs to look at us mortals to kill us, who can say that it is completely meaningless as long as he can look at us one more time in the crowd?" The wrinkles on old Master Chow's face were filled with calmness and carefreeness. He said, "Even if it is as you say, that our appearance is meaningless, as long as we appear there, there is meaning." Grand Secretary Zheng Jing was the first to understand the meaning of this sentence and nodded in agreement. The Academy is the Academy of the Tang Empire, and the Tang Empire is the Tang Empire of the Academy. The Tang Empire respects the Academy and worships it with all their might. But have you ever seen any Tangs humble themselves to the Academy and treat themselves as servants? They were also protected, but they were completely different from the countries that were bullied by the shrines. Why was it like this? Of course, it was the rules set by the Academy and the headmaster of the Academy. But more importantly, it was the attitude of the Tangs. Old Master Chow said, "We are not the pigs and dogs raised by Taoism in the Yen Kingdom, the South Jin Kingdom and the Song Kingdom. We are the owners of this land, so we need to appear there even if we die." Qin Chi was the military counselor of the Fish Dragon Gang. He was good at strategizing, but he rarely went to the battlefield. He judged the situation based on the results of his actions. At this moment, when he heard old Master Chow's words, he seemed to be touched. "Since we have to die, of course the old and the weak should die first. I have lived for more than 70 years, it is time for me to die." Old Master Chow stood up shakily with the help of the table. He took the cane from the bed warming maid beside him and walked out with the help of an old servant. Grand Secretary Zheng Jing said, "I am also old, I should go with Erba." Mrs. Zheng said, "I am a useless woman, I should go there." Old Master Chow gestured for Qin Chi to bring some people to keep an eye on Zheng Jing and his wife. He smiled and said, "If Ning Ke sees that his father-in-law and mother-in-law have been tricked by me to die, I am really afraid that he will give up in anger." There was no spring breeze in the Spring Breeze Pavilion today, only cold snowflakes dancing in the air. The front door of the Chow Mansion was wide open. Old Master Chow walked out to the street with the old and weak servants, as well as some elders among the refugees. Old Master Chow held a cane in his hand and knocked on doors as he walked. He called for friends and companions, calling out all the neighbors he was familiar with over the past few decades. "I only want the old ones, not the young ones," Old Master Chow said. He did not look serious, nor did he look sad. Instead, he was smiling as if he was asking these old guys to drink tea and play chess at the West Lake. The old guys in the neighborhood did not think much of it. The Tangs valued martial arts, and they had all been soldiers in the past. To them, this trip to the Vermilion Bird Avenue was like setting off to the battlefield. This was very common. They even felt that they had returned to the military camp in the past, and they were very excited. After Qin Shi dealt with Zheng Jing and his wife, he quickly walked out of the Chow mansion to catch up with Old Master Chow. He saw dozens of old men and their nephews, full of fierce aura. Looking at this scene, he revealed a bitter and slightly mocking smile. He thought to himself that such a large crowd was just to let the god take one more look. What a stupid and idiotic behavior. Although he was thinking this, his speed did not slow. Not long after, he had reached the front of the crowd and replaced the old servant to support Old Master Chow's body. There was no other way. He was also a Tangs, and sometimes the Tangs were so stupid and idiotic. There was a Taoist temple on a certain street. The person in charge of the affairs of the Taoist temple was a skinny Taoist. The skinny Taoist liked to eat noodles the most. Other than cooking noodles, the thing he did the most in his life was to repair the eaves of his neighbors that had been destroyed by the storm. This was because this was the only work he could do. If he did not want to do this, he would need to save for a long time to buy some good wine and entice his neighbors to come and listen to him preach the teachings of West Hill. This Taoist temple was very inconspicuous, but many things happened here that would be written in history. For example, Yi Su, the world wayfarer of Haoyan Taoism, used to be a preacher here, the eldest brother of the academy, and Yi Su once had a debate in front of the stone steps, and Yi Su once comprehended Tao here. He destroyed the Taoist temple and then built a new one. The skinny Taoist was an ordinary Taoist. He only knew the status of Yi Su's Taoist bun, but did not know his real identity. He also did not know that these things had happened in his small Taoist temple. Otherwise, he would not be as troubled as he was now, or he might be even more troubled. "I am very troubled." The skinny Taoist looked at the disciples in front of him, and his face was full of worry. He said, "I really do not know what to do. Do you have any ideas?" The little Taoist recited the scriptures every day. How could they come up with any ideas? The skinny Taoist looked up at the burning snow clouds in the sky and said, "I have indeed heard of the Jisho Abbey. That is the unknown place of our Haoyan Taoism, and the Abbey Dean is equivalent to our founding master." A little Taoist said, "But I heard from the neighbors that the founding master is going to destroy Chang and Sitij, so I am very troubled. Do you think we should help the founding master or stop him?" The skinny Taoist sighed. Suddenly, he stomped his feet heavily as if he was venting his anger, and shouted at the burning snow clouds in the sky, "I don't care if he is the founding master or whatever. I've been taking care of this Taoist temple my entire life. Even if Haoyan wants to destroy my Taoist temple, I will fight him to the end." The skinny Taoist left the small Taoist temple with the little Taoist priests. They carried the heavy incense burner and the old wood that had been piled up in the corner, ready to fight against their own founding master. Different from the people on the second street of Spring Breeze Pavilion, the struggle in their hearts was even more intense. But once they had made up their minds, they did not hesitate any longer and focused on doing something. This was because they were all people of faith. Being an enemy of Haoyan Taoism seemed to be a serious violation of their faith. But whether it was the skinny Taoist or the little Taoist priests, they had long been unclear about what they believed in. They were Tangs who had lived in Chang and City their entire lives. They used to think that they believed in Haoyan, but when they carried the incense burner and the wooden stick out of the Taoist temple, they realized that they believed in faith itself. In short, they were all people of faith. In the teachings of the West Hill Divine Palace, suicide was a serious crime. As a Taoist priest, it was a serious crime to be an enemy of Haoyan Taoism. They would definitely receive the cruelest punishment from Haoyan. Old Master Chow and his companions appeared on the Vermilion Bird Avenue, which was suicide. The skinny Taoist and the little Taoist priest stood in front of the Abbey Dean, which was apostasy and blasphemy. In other words, they all had sins that could not be washed away. There were many people like them. 3 Taoists from the Southern Gate Temple were setting up a tactical array. They were powerhouses from the Imperial Center administration and the most devout believers of Haoyan. Their faces were pale and their hearts were in great pain. But they did not hesitate in their actions. The old lady of Chu, with all the women and children in her residence, stood on the long street. The old lady was the widow of Chu Xiongtu, the general of the 16th Guards. Her silver hair fluttered in the wind and snow. She had 7 sons and 37 grandsons in her life. In the past decades, 2 sons and 3 grandsons had died at the borders of the Tang Empire. This year, in Yanjing, the 7 stockade villages and the Pamir Mountains, another 11 of her grandchildren had died in battle. Now all the men of the Chu residence were fighting with the invaders on the battlefields of the Tang Empire. She only had a dozen old, weak women and children with her and only a few knives. She knew that coming here was suicide, but she looked indifferent and did not care. The Chu family was full of loyal warriors. Even if they all died, they would still be loyal warriors. If Hao Yin had eyes. Then, on this snowy street, everyone was guilty, committing different sins. Today, Chang'an was a city of sin. What a city of sin. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 797. The quietus spread out from the Abidin's eye and was swallowed by Ning Kei's Tao Tai. Through the array eye pestle, it covered the entire city of Chang'an. As a result, the wind and snow became more violent and the coldness was everywhere. The Vermilion Bird Avenue was also very cold. But as more and more Tangs appeared on the wall and on the street, they stood shoulder to shoulder and squeezed on the street, their heels stepping on each other. The temperature on the street gradually rose. The ice and snow melted and even made people feel a little hot. The Tangs' hearts were very hot, so their blood heated up until their bodies were boiling. They clenched their fists and waved their arms to vent their anger. The Vermilion Bird Avenue was filled with shouts and curses. People kept smashing bricks, and some even threw chamber pots, tea leftovers and boys' urine at the Abidin. The Tangs believed in Hao Yin, but strangely they believed that man could conquer heaven. This was because although the headmaster of the academy had ignored the affairs of the world for many years, his indomitable spirit of fighting against heaven had spread to every town in the Tang Empire through the academy, the royal family, the imperial court, and the army. Therefore, even though they knew that the Taoist in indigo on the street was a powerhouse beyond the imagination of ordinary people and was truly invincible in the world, and in front of this person ordinary people were as weak as ants. However, the 2 Senyuanli teenagers dared to kill him with knives and forks. Even if the Abidin was a man-eating monster, they still had to give him a try. We can't beat you with so many people, but can't we scold you with so many mouths? Even if this guy was shameless and didn't hurt you, wouldn't you be embarrassed if I poured feces and urine on you? The snow street looked like a holy palace, with a kind of otherworldly beauty. The wind and snow were also clean without a speck of dust, just like Hao Yin's face. Now with the attack of the crowd, the long street suddenly became filthy. Blasphemous shouts and curses, as well as the stench from the human world, drifted into the sky with the wind and snow, smearing Hao Yin's face in an extremely embarrassing way. The Abidin looked at the filthy breath of the human world drifting into the sky and slightly raised his eyebrows. The feces and urine could not stain his clothes at all, but it made him slightly angry. Within his field of vision, there were at least several thousand Tang on the snowy street. He could also sense that even more Tang were hurrying toward Vermilion Bird Avenue to meet their deaths. The Abidin was slightly surprised to see so many Tangs on the long street, but he did not care. What he cared about was carrying out the will of Hao Yin and ending the 1,000-year history left by the headmaster in the human world. At this time Chang'an was full of wind and snow. Hidden in the wind and snow were countless talismans that Ning Kei had written before. Those talismans had successfully filled up many gaps in the God-stunning array. There was only one way. Nothing had changed from the previous situation. The Abidin had to kill Ning Quebec. Ning Kei was on the Vermilion Bird Avenue, and between him and the Abidin was a vast crowd. So the Abidin walked into the crowd. The Abidin's name was Chin Mao. He had the most ordinary name and looked like an ordinary person. When he walked into the crowd, he was like a drop of water that melted into the ocean of people. Then there was a storm in the ocean and countless figures were sent flying. It was like the waves hitting the reefs, bringing with them white snow as they dissipated in the dangerous natural environment. Those men in indigo who had rushed over with knives fell in a pool of blood. More than a dozen Yulin royal guards who were charging on horses fell off their horses when they were still dozens of feet away from the Abidin. The Abidin's figure gradually appeared in the ocean of people. Behind him was a mess. Under the pressure of the horrible aura, the crowd gradually parted to make a path. At this time, the cultivators of the Tang Empire finally made their move. The Imperial Center administration had quietly lurked in the surrounding marketplaces. Several array tactical masters started the encircling array. The chi of heaven and earth on the Vermilion Bird Avenue suddenly changed violently. Countless streams of primordial chi turbulence turned into countless primordial chi locks that appeared in the air around the Abbey Dean, blocking all his escape routes. Almost at the same time, more than a dozen military sword masters who were hiding among the ordinary people suddenly made their moves. With a clear clanging sound, bright flying swords broke through the air and pierced toward the Abbey Dean's face. The Abbey Dean's expression did not change at all. He gently brushed his sleeves and continued to move forward. With a flick of his sleeve, the sword wheel that crisscrossed the long street instantly turned into straw that had been soaked by the rain. It was soft and dispirited, powerless to dissipate. And the countless dangerous yuan chi locks, in this moment, were like ripe apples in autumn that had fallen to the ground. They shattered into mud and splashed with juice. The Tang-Array tactical masters who were hiding in the market were shocked by the primordial chi and bled to death on the spot. More than a dozen military sword masters, whose natal swords were destroyed by the Abbey Dean, were also seriously injured, and it was unknown whether they were still alive or not. The Abbey Dean continued to move forward, looking for Ning Ke behind the crowd. The crowd was disturbed. The flying bricks stopped for a moment and then continued to fall like a storm. However, even the flying swords of cultivators could not touch the Abbey Dean, let alone the bricks. Even Master Huang Yang's prayer beads could not trap the Abbey Dean for a moment, let alone the dirty water. The Abbey Dean moved forward calmly. Those who stood in his way were crushed to death like ants. The brave Tangs continued to rush toward him and then continued to die. The snow street became a street of blood. Blood sprayed everywhere. Courage was a respectable word in the human world. But in the face of the absolute power that represented Hao Yin, it seemed so weak and laughable. It was even hard to describe it as heroic. Faced with an insurmountable gap, the people in Chang'an should have been like ants looking up at the blue sky, feeling hopeless and then giving up. But it was hard to imagine that on the faces of the Tangs, one could see sorrow, anger, and unwillingness, but not a trace of despair. They did not despair, they did not cry, and they did not even swear. They just continued to fight in silence. Even if it was a hopeless fight, they would fight to the end. A coolie carrier picked up a shoulder pole and smashed it at the Abbey Dean. Then he died. A peddler from another county picked up a dagger that was used to save his life in the deep mountains. Then he died. A man of unknown identity threw himself at the Abbey Dean. Then he died. People smashed him with bricks, chopped him with kitchen knives, and shot at him with their ancestral bows and arrows. Then they died. They were courting death. Courting death was not a nice word. It seemed a bit stupid. But people were such wonderful creatures. Even though they knew that many things could not be changed, many people still insisted on doing it for one reason or another. People even created a word with a similar meaning. Courting death. The Tangs were courting death today. They were all courting death. They wanted to stop the Abbey Dean. The towering city walls of Chang'an could not stop the enemies. So they built a new city wall with their own flesh and blood. Also, try to write it before 12 o'clock. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 798. The people on the street, those who stood in front of the Abbey Dean, those who fell in the pool of blood, and all the people who formed the new city wall knew that their deaths would not change anything. But they still did it. Because 1,000 years ago, the headmaster of the academy and their ancestors founded the Tang Empire by the Wei Sisui River. From that day on they had changed themselves. Ning Ke had said this to the Abbey Dean before. He knew that he could not defend, but he still had to defend. This was his understanding of defense. The Tangs who were dying at this moment seemed to prove his words. However, Ning Ke's heart began to tremble as he looked at the blood-stained street and the people who fell one after another. The remaining frost on his eyelashes made a cracking sound. A clear whistle came from afar. He knew that eldest brother had finally arrived and made a move. This was not the opportunity that the academy had been looking for. The academy's opportunity was with Ning Quebec. However, eldest brother could not wait any longer in the face of the blood-stained street. Just like Ning Ke, he could not bear it any longer. He had been in this world for more than 20 years, but he still believed that he was an atypical Tangs. He had seen too much darkness and always believed in the cold-blooded survival rule. He was willing to pay any price as long as he could live. His heart was as cold as his body that had been frozen by the Abbey Dean's quietus. Most of the ice and snow had fallen off. Ning Ke's body was still cold, but he felt that his body was gradually becoming hot. The blood in his veins began to boil, and he experienced a long-lost feeling. That feeling was called hot blood. He did not like words like tragic or stirring, and the feeling of hot blood was taboo. However, how could the blood from the Aberdeen's wounds not be hot when he saw so many people dying in front of him? However, hot blood represented hope and desire. Ning Ke longed to live and hoped to defeat the Aberdeen. Facing the ending of the story where there was no hope, what was the use of hot blood? From time to time, someone ran past him and rushed to the Aberdeen not far away. He picked up the padao that had fallen from the snow and struggled to support his body. The blade of the padao pierced through the snow and stabbed into the hard bluestone street. Eldest brother was defeated again. Blood gushed out from the holes in his cotton-padded robe. He stood in the south of the Vermilion Bird Avenue, coughing painfully and desolately. He had no idea where Yu Lian had gone. The Aberdeen kept walking forward. He killed many people, knocked many people away, passed many people, ignored many people, and walked forward step by step, leaving blood behind him. There were casualties everywhere on Vermilion Bird Avenue. The Aberdeen stopped not far from Ning, Quebec. Between the two of them, there were only a few hundred old, weak women and children left. The skinny Taoist had lived in Chang'an all his life. He had turned from an ordinary little Taoist into a Taoist now, but he still lived in that small Taoist temple. He had never seen the red-robed priest from the West Hill Divine Palace. A few years ago, when the great divine priest of Revelation was sent to Chang'an, he knelt for a whole night and did not have the chance to listen to the great divine priest's teachings. At this moment he finally saw the true supreme person of Haotian Taoism. His body trembled uncontrollably. He wanted to kneel in front of the Taoist in indigo and kiss his feet devoutly. He suddenly shouted and took the incense burner from the little Taoist and threw it at the Aberdeen. The incense burner was used by the small Taoist temple to worship Haotian. It was made of real bronze and very heavy. The skinny Taoist had a heavy heart and was very thin, so he could not throw it far. With a muffled sound, the incense burner hit the skinny Taoist's feet. His feet started to bleed and he cried out in pain. He did not fall down with the help of the little Taoist. Old Lady Chu took the horseman's saber from her third daughter-in-law and stood in front of the Aberdeen. Old Master Chow walked to the front of the crowd from the back with his walking stick. The Aberdeen looked calm and his eyes were extremely indifferent. In his eyes, there seemed to be hundreds of millions of stars annihilated, and then there was only emptiness left. It was frightening and awe-inspiring. Under the gaze of this emptiness, everything would end. The Tangs who were ready to die, the unyielding Chang and the great Tang Empire, the 1,000-year academy, all the glory and blood, heroic and sinful, bright and dark time, would end here. The long street was cold and bleak. Looking at the Aberdeen's ordinary face and eyes, Ning Ke suddenly thought of the great people he had met or felt in his life. Whether it was the headmaster, youngest uncle, or Lotus, they were all people who were truly enlightened, freed themselves, and understood what they really wanted. That was why they were unimaginably powerful. The Aberdeen was also such a person. Today the Academy was defeated by the Aberdeen. It was a matter of course. The Academy believed that it was a matter of course, so it should be as calm and composed as those who died on the long street. But he could not do that, because he was not reconciled to it. The Xiangwan Plain was a pasture with excellent water and grass in the north of the Tang Empire. Now this pasture had become the most tragic battlefield. The cavalry of the Golden Tribe Royal Court and the elite cavalry of the Northern Battlefront Army had been fighting for a key riding path at the edge of the pasture for 3 days and 3 nights. The cavalry of the Golden Tribe, who had the advantage in numbers, had finally suppressed the Tang army to several hills in the north of the riding path after paying a heavy price. They were launching the final attack. The war horses collided with each other, producing a dull and terrifying sound. The friction between curved blades and straight blades produced an ear-piercing sound. The sounds of killing and war drums, however, were much quieter, because both sides were exhausted to the extreme. The battle on horseback had turned into a battle on foot. The last 1,000 Tang soldiers used their last strength and life to resist the attack of the cavalry of the Golden Tribe. But they were about to collapse. A Tang military officer and a dozen of his subordinates were surrounded by the warriors of the Golden Tribe. The officer was a little short and not as strong as the ordinary Tang soldiers. But at such a critical moment he burst out with unimaginable combat power and cut down 3 enemies in a row. Several curved blades broke through the air. The short officer raised his blade and was forced to kneel on one knee, struggling to support himself. He heard cries of pain coming from around the hills. Through the fluttering hair in front of his eyes, he saw many of his companions fall and those barbarians cruelly stabbing the bodies of their companions. Could they really not hold on any longer? He thought. Could they really not hold on until the main force of cavalry came back? No despair could be seen on his pale and delicate face. He did not think that he should be desperate. because he was not reconciled. A troop was running wildly in the wilderness of the eastern border. They were the cavalry of the valiant cavalry battalion. They had left Chang'an to fight in the eastern border. At this time they were in a hurry to return to Chang'an. The cavalry and their mounts were already exhausted, but no one asked for a rest. Because they had finally confirmed the whereabouts of Prince Longqing and the 2,000 grassland elite cavalry. Longqing was marching towards Chang'an. This meant that the coalition against the Tang Empire was sure that Chang'an could be broken through. Cao Xiaoshu's face was as thin as a hard stone that had been cut open, dark and haggard. The cold wind blew on his face. It was many days late. He and his cavalry had just gone after them. They should not be able to catch up. Even if they caught up, what could they do? But he still asked his subordinates to continue running towards Chang'an, because he was not reconciled. These 2 chapters don't have a lot of words, but I really can't help it. Recently, I've been writing as hard as I can. Tomorrow is Saturday and I'll have 1 chapter on Sunday. Then I'll start writing 2 chapters on Monday. Yes, I swear on my father's character that even if I'm not good at other things, everyone should still be able to recognize my seriousness towards my work. So, please rest assured in this aspect I'll definitely write well. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 799. The flames danced wildly on the silver mask and in the black eyes, like lightning in the summer rain. It was winter and snowflakes were falling. It was not Chang'an where the chi of heaven and earth was restless, so there was no lightning. It was real flames. The snow-covered fields and the beautiful and quiet village by the state highway should have been a beautiful picture. But after being burned by the fierce flames, it suddenly became a black and desolate wasteland. Prince Longqing looked at the scene in front of him quietly with an indifferent expression. There was no excitement on his face. Only his hand that was tightly holding the reins revealed some of his real emotions at this time. After leading the Eastern Wilderness Cavalry into the Tang territory, he only ordered his subordinates to set 2 fires. One was in the distant eastern border, and the other was in the village at this time. He led 2,000 of his most elite cavalry subordinates to attack Chang'an at all costs. Neither the Tang Volunteer Army nor the troublesome valiant cavalry battalion could catch up with him. They were very close to Chang'an. When he lost to Ning Ke in the Academy's mountain climbing examination, he left Chang'an with the West Hill Divine Palace's diplomatic corps and the papal cavalrymen. On the state highway he recalled the scenes he had seen and the feelings he had back then. Then he thought of the great ambition he had once made. I want to pull down all these ugly Tang houses and eradicate all the rape flowers in the fields. Then I will burn them all. I will burn away all the evil and filth, so that there will only be light left in this world. He was about to return to Chang'an, which had left him with endless humiliation and pain. In a sense it had changed his life. His cultivation state and strength were far better than before, but his eyes were no longer pure and bright. In the fields beside the road, the rape flowers have not yet grown. The houses painted by the farmers of the Tang Empire are still as beautiful or ugly as they were in the past. Then let's burn them all down. And tell the people in Chang'an that he was coming. It was snowing in Chang'an and it was raining in the north of Shao Mountain. But it was equally cold. The rain soaked through the armor and coat, seeped into the clothes and went straight to the body. It was more unbearable. In the cold rain, the entire southern battlefront army was marching northward. Figures of the Tang army were everywhere in the forest of Shao Mountain. They were so dense that they looked like leaves that had fallen in the forest for thousands of years. The march was very difficult. The cold weather and rain, the rotting leaves and the trampled mountain paths were all their enemies. Many people had already fallen behind along the way. Even more people continued to move forward. Even if their faces were pale and their bodies and minds were exhausted, they still gritted their teeth and lowered their heads, following the people in front of them as they crawled through the muddy wilderness. Only by clenching their teeth could they continue to persevere. Only by remaining silent could they conserve their last bit of strength. Only by lowering their heads could the exhausted people clearly see the direction of the march. More than 100,000 soldiers of the Tang army walked in the mountains and fields without making much noise. Only the sound of military boots stepping on the mud and the occasional sound of heavy objects falling could be heard. This kind of silence made one's heart palpitate, and it was what made their enemies most afraid of them. From the generals to the ordinary soldiers of the Tang army, they firmly believed that even if the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition army really had millions of troops, as long as they could arrive, they would definitely be able to stop the enemy. They had to rush to the north of the Verdant Canyon. The West Hill Divine Palace Coalition army did not give them much time. They had no time to sleep or eat hot meals. All their time was spent on the road. They walked in the day, in the night, in the snow, in the rain, and in the miasma in the dense forest. They kept walking on the road. However, the road was too long after all. The Southern Battlefront Army had tried their best, but they were still some distance from the north of the Verdant Canyon. It had been a few days since the arrival date set by the military ministry. Logically speaking, the Verdant Canyon should have been lost. There was no point for the Southern Battlefront Army to rush there, and it would be dangerous. What they should do now was to find out the enemy's situation and then retreat to wait for reinforcements. But the Southern Battlefront Army was still rushing because they had not received a new military order. Their task was still to rush to the Verdant Canyon and defend where they were because they almost blindly believed in the ability of the Academy. Because they were not reconciled. On the other side of the Shao Mountain, the clouds were thin and the rain was light. The rain pattered on the calm field and was instantly absorbed by the soil. It was impossible to wash away the blood accumulated in the past 7 days, but it only made it a little wet. The ground in front of the Verdant Canyon was relatively hard because it had been crushed by the chi of heaven and earth of 3 peerless powerhouses in a row. The rain seeped slowly and accumulated in the messy hoof prints. There was a rumble in the distance in the south of the field. The earth began to shake and the shallow water in the hoof prints began to sway. The catapult from the South Gene Kingdom has finally arrived. The sixth brother looked at the things that appeared in the distance and felt the vibration coming from under his feet. His body, which looked like it was cast from iron, was covered with countless bloodstains. Even the hammer had deep marks on it. The fourth brother sat under the iron canopy, holding the river and mountain sandbox and struggling to fight against the virtual sword left by the Abbey Dean a few days ago. Except for him, the other disciples of the Academy had been seriously injured. There was a flower in Wang Chi's hair, which had been dyed black with blood. The front of Shiman Buhua's robe was stained with blood and his face was as pale as paper. Beigong Weiyang's hands fell on the blood-stained zither, twitching like a bird's claws. Junimo had changed into a new set of clothes. It was plain and bloodless, and his left sleeve was fluttering in the cold wind. His head was lowered and he looked very tired. He looked at the water in the hoof prints in front of him and remained silent. There were broken limbs and corpses everywhere in front of the Verdant Canyon. Only around him was relatively empty. After Liu Bai retreated, there was a series of battles in front of the Verdant Canyon. Every time the Divine Hall Coalition army was about to devour the Academy disciples, there would always be sword light and zither music in the pool of blood. Yi Hongyu stood in the distance and her divine robe of judgment was stained with blood. 7 days later she finally saw the dawn of victory. After all, the Academy was not Haotian and could not be omnipotent. Junimo slowly bowed and picked up the high crown that had fallen on the ground. Since he lost the crown in the battle with Liu Bai, he had not paid attention to it because he had no time. The crown was stained with blood and ashes. He slowly frowned and wanted to brush off the blood and ashes. But he had lost his left hand and was holding the crown in his right hand. Miyu walked to his side and took the crown. She carefully wiped it with the embroidered handkerchief in her hand. Junimo leaned forward as if he was bowing to her. Muyu's eyes were slightly wet and she smiled back. This was bowing to him. Muyu said, "I agree to marry you." Junimo said calmly, "That's good." Muyu put the crown on his head and carefully straightened it. This was a proper crown. Junimo said, "A proper crown is a proper death." Muyu said, "It's reasonable to die together." Cries rang out in front of the Verdant Canyon. Beigong Weiyang broke the zither strings and blood splashed everywhere. He cried out, "I can't accept it. I'll start writing 2 chapters tomorrow. There'll be 2 chapters of 3,000 words. Please supervise me and vote for me. I'll try my best to write them. I won't let you vote unwillingly. Thank you." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 800. Ning Ke lowered his head and stood on the snowy street. Blood kept flowing out of the holes in his fingers. The frozen blood clots were washed away by fresh blood from time to time. He looked miserable. He held the Array pestle in one hand and the hilt in the other. But he could not write a talisman or wield his blade. If it were not for the Padao supporting his body, he might fall down again at any time. He did not look at the Abbey Dean's eyes, because he might die if he made eye contact with the Abbey Dean. He could only look at the Abbey Dean's feet, and his eyes were as low as the dust under the snow. He was covered in blood. Except for his own, most of it was the blood of the ordinary people who had died in the hands of the Abbey Dean. He felt that the fresh blood was hotter than his own. Stimulated by the blood of the ordinary people, his blood had already heated up. But what made him sad was that his body was cold and so was his heart. No matter how unwilling he was frozen by the coldness of quietus. He could not find any strength, only fatigue and helplessness. Countless talismans of Yin were still floating in the streets and alleys of Chang and hidden in the wind and snow. They did not disperse with the help of the God-stunning array. This was Ning Kei's most powerful skill. But it had been proven that it could not defeat the Abbey Dean. He looked at the Abbey Dean's feet as if he saw the corpses of ants under the soles of the Abbey Dean's shoes. These ants were the bravest and most fearless, but now they were all dead. Even amazing courage could not change the gap between heaven and man. Then what else could the people in the human world do except to surrender to Haotian? What was the point of being unwilling? The Abbey Dean had been cultivating Haotian's ruthlessness all his life. Besides, he was good at foresight and forbearance. Those who could forbear and those who could forbear did not have any unbearable heart. Although the Tangs who fought to be the first to die on the snowy street did not change the outcome of the battle, the incredible scene still surprised him. Not because he could not bear it but because he was puzzled. The Abbey Dean had seen many people who could face the final end calmly, but all of them were grand cultivators who had transcended the mortal world. There were very few ordinary people. In the city of Chang'an, there were so many ordinary people who could face death calmly, which was beyond his expectation. In other words, it was beyond his evaluation of ordinary people. Maybe the Tangs are really special. The Abbey Dean looked at the old people and the weak people in front of him with his hands behind his back. Looking at their fearless faces in the wind and snow, he suddenly asked, "Are you willing to die like ants?" It was old Chow who answered him. Old Master Chow leaned on his walking stick and walked shakily to the front of the crowd. He said, "Being willing is sweet, being willing is comfortable. How can you let yourself feel comfortable? I don't know what the people outside will say, but for us old Chang'an people, as long as we don't feel ashamed when we die, we will feel comfortable." Old to die to die. The Abbey Dean looked at old Master Chow and said, "You are extraordinary. How should I address you?" The Abbey Dean looked at old Chow and said, "The Abbey to the Dean. There is nothing special about me. We are just ordinary people. But no matter if we are the most ordinary people or the most extraordinary people like you, we are all human. As long as we are human, we all have to die." The meaning of old Chow's words was clear. No matter if you were the Abbey Dean of the Jishou Abbey or a follower of Haotian, you would become a pile of dirt or ashes after death. Then we were equal. That is why so many people are fighting to die. The Abbey Dean looked at the Tang corpses on the Vermilion Bird Avenue and said thoughtfully, "The Tangs have a tradition of dying." Old Master Chow's expression gradually became solemn and he said, "In the first battle with the various countries, when the wind and rain were precarious, none of the Tangs surrendered. In the battle with the desolate, none of the Tangs surrendered. Since the founding of the Tang Empire by the Sisui River, it has been more than 1,000 years since the founding of the Tang Empire. Back then, Emperor Taizu risked his country's destruction and exhausted the nation's power to send his army to the northern wilderness. He did not return until all the enemies were killed. The academy dared to compete with Buddhism and Taoism for a lonely young girl. Mr. Second only vented his anger when he destroyed the stone statue of Buddha Ku. The Tang is strong because it dares to hate. The Tang Empire is strong because of the Tangs." Old Master Chow looked at the Abbey Dean and said in a hoarse voice, "Since the ancient times, there have been people who worked hard in the Tang Empire. There were people who worked hard. There were people who stood up in the face of injustice and bullying. There were people who died in the face of invasion. The Southern Army marched towards the verdant canyon in the forest of the Shao Mountain. The cold rain seeped into their collars, taking away the warmth and bringing the sick. Soldiers fell off the cliff from time to time. Their companions stood silently at the edge of the cliff for a while before continuing forward. They tiredly lowered their heads. Even though they knew it was already too late, they still refused to stop running. Risking their lives, they ran unreasonably, desperately rushing their way. Yang Erxi killed a barbarian from the eastern wilderness. He treasured the machete he got from the battlefield. He sheathed the machete and took the pitchfork from his shoulder. Then he smashed the barbarian to make sure he was dead. The sounds of fighting in the field gradually subsided. He wiped the sweat off his forehead and panted heavily as he looked around. Then he saw a few familiar companions lying on the snow-covered winter fields. After the battle, he stood in front of the shallow mounds and kept silent for a long time. Then he looked in the direction of his hometown. He missed his wife's braised pig's trotters. The wall of the school in his hometown had not been finished. Back then, because he felt that the salary given by the yamen was not fair, he refused to take the job. He quarreled with the village chief and almost flipped the table. He was even ready to go to the county government to file a lawsuit. It was not until he could not stand his daughter's anger and his wife's grumbling that he reluctantly took the job. But he saw the notice halfway through. He carried the pitchfork and meat and wine and left his hometown for the distant eastern border. He did not know when the wall of the school would be finished. He did not know if he had the chance to finish it. At least it was in his hands. Yang Erxi looked in the direction of his hometown and thought of these troublesome things. He furrowed his brows in annoyance, and the newly added scar split open again. Blood flowed down. He raised his arm and wiped it with his sleeve. He suddenly thought of the teacher in the school. Now he would not be angry because of the unfinished wall. So he laughed happily. The battle on the Xiangwan plain was still fierce. The short officer was forced to kneel on one knee by the barbarians' machetes. He was in a very dangerous situation. He was struggling to hold on. A black shadow flew up from the side and heavily smashed into the bodies of those barbarians. The bright machete slashed across the meadow that seemed to be burning. The black shadow fell to the ground with 2 cuts on his chest. Blood was dripping and it seemed that he would not survive. The officer recognized that it was his close attendant. He shouted in grief and indignation. The padao in his hand left his head and slashed toward the opposite side. At this moment he did not even think that the machete above his head would cut him in half. He was very lucky. The barbarians who besieged him were killed by him, but he did not die. He had been cut in the shoulder, and the blood flowed like the milk wine in a cut wineskin. The most dangerous thing was that his helmet was knocked off by the enemy's machete. The enemy's blade, after knocking off his helmet, also cut open his hair bun. Her black hair was draped over her shoulders, and her delicate face was not covered by her armor. At this moment, everyone could see that this officer was actually a woman. She was Situ Ilan. She carried the heavy padao with wounds and anger all over her body. She led the last of her subordinates and started to fight again. She did not know how long she would fight, but she knew that she would fight until death or victory. There is a saying in Chang and that can entrust a lonely person 6 feet away. Old Master Chow looked at the Abbey Dean and continued. At this time, the distant imperial palace was shrouded in wind and snow. Tang Xiaotang stood in the snow in front of the palace, quietly looking at the south. The empress held the little emperor's hand and stood behind the sill, looking at the increasingly heavy snow outside the palace. A cough came from the other end of the street. Eldest brother came out. His cotton-padded jacket had long been torn. Cotton peeked out from inside, white as snow, and some places were dyed red like blood. Fresh and bright, very moving. Ning Kei stood at the other end of the street, also covered in blood. He held the array pestle, the blood coagulating the pestle in the palm of his hand. This pestle, this array, and this city were entrusted to him by his teachers and his majesty. Then he would not let it go until he died. Old Master Chow's hand holding the crutch trembled slightly, and his voice suddenly became excited. I can entrust my life 100 miles away, in front of the verdant canyon. Junimo had straightened his clothes and hat. He held the iron sword in one hand and looked at the enemy cavalry in the wilderness. He was expressionless and began to burn the last of his psyche power. As if the whole world could feel the heat brought by his burning life, the rain suddenly stopped, and the rain clouds above the wilderness gradually dissipated, revealing a line of blue sky. Sunlight shone through the gaps in the clouds and fell on him. On the academy's fellow disciples. Old Master Chow looked at the street full of Tang corpses and suddenly burst into tears. Then he laughed and shouted to the Abbey Dean. I can't take away the important thing, a gentleman. The old voice echoed in the Vermilion Bird Avenue, in the wind and snow, on the Winter Willow and Snow Lake, in front of the Verdant Canyon, in the Shao Mountain, in the eastern border, in the northern border, and in every inch of the Tang Empire. I can entrust my life 100 miles away. I can entrust my life 100 miles away. I can't take away the important thing, a gentleman. The Tang Empire has never lacked such people. The Tang Empire is a country of gentlemen. Old Master Chow stared into the Abbey Dean's eyes and said sternly, such a beautiful country is going to be destroyed by you evil old Taoists. You still ask me if I'm willing? He raised his crutch and was about to smash it. I'm willing, your grandmother. This chapter took a lot of effort and a long time to write. The next chapter may be a little later. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 801. The impassioned and powerful declaration suddenly turned into dirty words with a double meaning. He shouted at the old master that he wanted to kill the Abbey Dean and smashed her with his staff. Ordinary people and extraordinary people were all human beings. They would turn into dust after death. But there was a big difference between them when they were alive. The old man's crutch could not beat the Abbey Dean. The people on the snow street all thought that old Master Chow was dead. But in fact he was not. The Abbey Dean did nothing and just walked past him calmly. The eldest brother vaguely guessed the Abbey Dean's intention. Taoism wanted to destroy Chang'an City and also the hearts of the people in Chang'an. The Abbey Dean's massacre on the Long Street was to use the most powerful means to smash the hardest shell of the Tangs and trample their pride into the mud. Since killing could not solve the problem, then he chose to ignore it. But the Abbey Dean did not know the Tangs very well. Old Chow had walked on the edge of life and death, but he did not become confused, suspicious or even afraid because of the Abbey Dean's ignorance. If he did not hit him, he would have another chance in the future. If he did not die, he did not die. Being alive was better than being dead. There was no need for self-doubt. Old Chow leaned on his crutch and walked to the side of the street, cursing. His words were dirty, even dirtier than the dirty things in the snow. The Abbey Dean raised his eyebrows slightly and continued to walk toward Ning, Quebec. They would soon reach the imperial palace. Eldest brother said, "This is not right." The Abbey Dean said, "Although the Tang Empire is strong, it is doomed. What can you do?" In front of the verdant canyon. Yi Hongyu looked at Jun Mo. Blood flowed down her sleeves and onto the ground, mixing with the blood stains that had accumulated over the past few days. She was very calm because she knew that Jun Mo was much more seriously injured than she was. He was burning the last of his psyche power and even his life, even though he was facing death. Looking at Jun Mo's expressionless face and the blood-soaked disciples of the academy behind him, she recalled the thrilling battles in front of the verdant canyon in the past 7 days. She thought about how these few people had blocked the mighty Divine Hall Coalition army in the south of the Tang Empire and prevented them from advancing north. Someone like Jun Mo, fighting bitterly and on the verge of death, even she couldn't help but be somewhat moved. The deepest part of her eyes was filled with the brilliance of the divine stars, as well as a bit of pity and admiration. What can you do if the heavens want to destroy your academy? She looked at Jun Mo. Jun Mo looked up at the sky. At this time the rain had stopped, but the clouds had not completely dispersed. Only a few spots of the clear sky could be seen like broken porcelain. Furthermore, even if the rain and clouds dispersed and the sky was completely clear, there was no way for him to see that bright moon. Before he died in battle, he only took a glance at his teacher. He did not directly answer Yi Hongyu's question. Instead he said, "Chow Xiaoshu is a very good person. If nothing had happened back then, he would have been my younger brother." Yi Hongyu knew who Chow Xiaoshu was, but she did not understand why Jun Mo would mention him at this time. Jun Mo looked at the sky, searching for the traces left by the bright moon on the previous 7 nights. He continued, "It's just that he liked to follow the former emperor, so he didn't enter the academy. Back then the former emperor was determined to clean up the imperial court, so there was that night at Spring Breeze Pavilion." Yi Hongyu knew the famous night at Spring Breeze Pavilion. The names of Chow Xiaoshu and Ning Ke were only noticed by the West Hill Divine Palace after that rainy night. Jun Mo withdrew his gaze and looked at her. He said, "Before that night, Chow Xiaoshu negotiated with the other party at the House of Red Sleeves. He said 2 sentences which were widely spread in Chang, and after that. At that time he said these 2 sentences. Jun Mo said, 'If the heavens can tolerate me, I can live. If not, I will kill.'" Yi Hongyu suddenly felt a little cold because she knew what she was going to hear next. Although the whole world was against the Tang Empire, and Haotian Taoism and the Tang Empire were irreconcilable, she still did not expect that in the world of Haotian, someone would raise this question so calmly and firmly. As expected, Jun Mo lightly shook his right arm, and the wide and square iron sword splashed down a stream of blood. He held the iron sword and looked at Yi Hongyu, as if he was looking at the sky above her head. He said, "I have always thought these 2 sentences were not appropriate, because even if the heavens cannot tolerate me, I still want to live. If the evil heavens really cannot tolerate me, then I cannot allow it to live either." He finally said, "At least I cannot let it live too happily." On the snowy street in Chang'an. Eldest brother looked at the Abbey Dean and said, "The headmaster once said that the heavens will obey the will of the people. If the heavens do not obey, if the heavens cannot tolerate, then what will you do?" The Abbey Dean stopped and looked at the falling snow. After a pause, he said thoughtfully, "You can look up and see if the heavens have ever spared anyone." It was quiet. No one spoke because no one could answer the Abbey Dean's question. In the face of absolute power, courage was admirable, but there was no power. In the cold eyes of the heavens, humans' will was never important. The skinny Taoist was silent. The old lady of Chu was silent. The injured were silent. The dead could not speak. Even Chao Erbai's lips moved for a while, but no words came out. Finally, a voice broke the silence of the world. The voice was very hoarse and dry. It was probably because he had not drunk water for a long time, and he had lost too much blood in his body. It sounded a little harsh to the ears. The voice sounded very tired and even a little weak. But it was very determined. The so-called harsh sound was not like the sound of a sharp object rubbing against a mirror, but the sound of a mirror breaking. The voice said, "Then destroy it." The Abbey Dean looked at the back of the crowd and saw Ning Kei's bloody face. Then he saw Ning Kei's eyes. Their eyes met for the first time in a long time. Ning Kei looked at him and said, "The heavens will obey the will of the people. If the heavens do not obey, then destroy it. I think this is a very simple truth." The Abbey Dean looked at the determination and confidence in his eyes and slowly raised his eyebrows. The natural stream magical finger had seriously injured Ning Kei and destroyed his confidence. But at that time his spiritual world was still firm. Later he gradually became a little absent-minded. He looked at the two youths crying and doing the most unimaginable thing in the world. So he decided to stand up. He really stood up. But he could only rely on the padao to support his weak body. Then countless ordinary people ran past him and ran towards the Black Sea of Death. He saw many people die in front of him. He felt that it was wrong. The choices of these ordinary people completely went against his understanding of this world and his rules. Although he had seen many similar scenes on the battlefield, the scene he saw today still brought him an unbearable mental shock. Because in the past he had always put himself out of the picture. Today he was on this street in the picture. His body and soul, along with the blood as the bodies fell and the souls scattered, finally landed on this world. In the past he was willing to die for Chang and because of his responsibility and affection. He insisted that it was not because he was hot-blooded, because of his responsibility and affection for the academy, the headmaster, his master Yensei and his majesty. He thought that his blood was cold. When the blood in his body began to heat up and even boil, he began to be confused and his mental state became a little absent-minded. He vaguely felt a kind of power. He had seen that kind of power more than once. But there had never been a time when he felt it more vividly than at this moment on the snowy street. At this moment, an old voice began to ring in his ears and heart. He did not know that it was Uncle Chao who was talking. The old voice echoed throughout the Tang Empire. His consciousness seemed to float to the great rivers and mountains. He saw all kinds of people everywhere. Those people were fighting, marching, risking their lives, persevering, or just waiting. But that kind of waiting was also full of a kind of impressive tenacity. He saw many people and they were all extraordinary people. Following that, many more scenes flashed past his eyes. He saw the blood-stained hatchet in the woodshed, the cracked fields of Hebei County, the starving people like ghosts, the vast Min Mountain, the old hunters, the soil of the city of Wei, the lanterns of Chang, and at night, the lake in the wilderness and the moss-covered tomb in the Lang Temple. He saw many people. Perhaps they were not extraordinary, but they were all people. He seemed to have returned to the stone statue of the Lang Temple and meditated. He seemed to have had his last conversation with Lotus in the White Bone Mountain at the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. He seemed to have seen the Talisman Master in the primitive tribe when he entered Talisman Taoism that summer. The earliest humans fought with wild beasts in the wilderness. They began to wear animal skins, eat meat, and live in caves. Then they began to farm, raise livestock, and eat more meat. They continued to eat meat and thought of many ways to cook meat to ensure that the meat was delicious. They could eat more meat because eating meat could make them stronger. He saw humans building houses, villages, and roads. Finally, he saw a magnificent city standing on the plains, as if it was going to pierce through the sky. That was Chang'an. He walked in Chang'an and saw the bun shop he had seen a few days ago. He remembered the aura that day, the power that only belonged to the human world. This power could change the world. This power could defeat time. This power was the most ordinary and the most extraordinary. It was the most dazzling and the most inconspicuous. It was the hot fog in the bun shop or a brick in the city wall. But it was also the inheritance of wisdom and unyielding resistance. Ning Kei suddenly felt very touched. This power was so great. But he was so close to it and he could feel it so clearly. He felt his own insignificance, but it was not like when he faced Hao Yan. He would not be angry because of his own insignificance, but only respect and yearn because of his own insignificance. Because no matter how insignificant he was still a part of this power. No matter how great this power was, it came from countless insignificant people like him. I will write 2 more chapters tomorrow. I will try my best. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chitian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 802. This was the power of the human world. It was not the first time that Ning Ke had sensed its existence. In the wilderness, the headmaster had summoned the ancient sword from the sword garret thousands of miles away to kill the golden dragon. He had used this power. In the houses across the Yanming Lake, he had also sensed this power. What he did not understand was how to use this power for himself. He had asked the headmaster of the academy about this. The headmaster of the academy said that he was the human world and his power was the power of the human world. The answer was simple and meaningless to him. He looked at the bright moon in the night sky and thought of the headmaster. He looked at the pine tree by the cliff and thought of the youngest uncle. He looked at the bloody front yard of the Lank temple and thought of Lotus. He thought of the last conversation with the headmaster by the Sisui River. It turned out that Lotus was right. The youngest uncle was proud and free. He wanted to represent the human world and pierce through the sky as a powerhouse. The headmaster of the academy thought that he was the human world and he wanted to lead the human world to challenge Haotian. However, the human world was where people lived. The power of the human world came from everyone who lived there. This power could not be represented and did not need to be led. It could only be exerted when everyone was together. The headmaster of the academy built the Tang Empire and was actually on the right path. However, the headmaster of the academy still wanted to lead everyone to do this through education and guidance. Because of his obsession, the state that Lotus had reached was still some distance away from the headmaster of the academy and the youngest uncle. However, it was also because of his obsession that he thought more extreme. In the night rain, he looked at his wife's grave and wanted to dig it up. However, he gave up and floated away. From that moment on, Lotus had gone crazy. After that, whether it was the destruction of the Devil's Doctrine or the massacre of Lank, it was all because he had gone crazy. He wanted to destroy the world. In his eyes, life and death had no meaning, including himself. He had been pursuing the devil to cover the sky and obey the heaven with Taoism. Finally, he reached the Nirvana realm with Buddhism and jumped out of the 3 realms. He wanted to erase the ruthless heaven's way of the old world in a brand new world and find something that he wanted to find through time. In other words, he wanted to break the most fundamental rule of the world. He wanted to destroy Haotian. And the method he chose was to make the entire human world go crazy with him, or even destroy it. This method was bloody and cruel, but it was correct. If Haotian knew that there was such a person who came up with such a crazy idea just because he wanted to resurrect his wife in the tomb, he would probably tremble. Ning Ke had wandered around the world with Sang Sang when he was a child, so he did not have much patience. Therefore, whenever Sang Sang could do something, he would teach her one thing. Do your own things. Therefore, the affairs of the human world should be done by people, and everyone should do it together. Ning Ke opened his eyes and found himself still standing on the snowy street. He did not know if he had already woken up or if he was still in a dream. He looked at the injured people on the street who were clenching their teeth and refusing to let out a scream. He looked at the corpses of the ordinary people. He looked at the 2 heavily injured but stubborn teenagers. He understood many things. Chang'an was not a city. It was people. It was everyone who lived in the city. The power of the human world came from everyone who lived here. Several people, dozens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of people. Everyone's wishes and desires were a kind of power. The desire of millions of people was the power of the human world. This power was so powerful that it could change the appearance of heaven and earth, and it could resist the passage of time. This power was like a bloody wave when it came to Lotus. This power was like the mark left by the sword when it came to youngest uncle. This power was like the desire of the headmaster to break the sky. But that wasn't even the full extent of this power. Lotus could not get the recognition of this power, or he did not have the opportunity to mobilize this power. Youngest uncle was heroic and unparalleled, so he was lonely. The headmaster could be called the teacher of all ages, but he forgot that the ink scroll should always be written by the students themselves. Master Yin Sei spent his whole life looking for that word. That word represented the power of the human world. But as the Abbey Dean once said, that word was too heavy. How could the will of millions not be heavy? And how could the will of millions be the same? Therefore no one could write that word. Even the headmaster could not write it. At this time, Ning Ke finally saw that word clearly. He saw many people on the Vermilion Bird Avenue. Thousands of ordinary people came together for the same purpose. They built a new city wall with their flesh and blood. The will of the people really became a city at this time. The will and desire of the tens of millions of people here were strong and united. This was a part of the human world. For Chang'an City, this was the most desperate and angry moment. But it was the best moment to write that word. The question Ning Ke needed to think about now was how to write that word. Seeing that word did not mean that he could write it. Just like when he first came to the old library and looked at the shelves full of precious classics, he looked at those words that he had seen countless times, but he could not even remember them, not to mention write them. He thought of the 3 months on the sea and the conversation with the headmaster. The headmaster said that Haotian was not the world itself, but the collection of the most fundamental rules of the world. The headmaster said that when the rules controlled the world was stable and boring. Only when the new power appeared and broke the old rules, the world could be lively and interesting again. The headmaster said that human was the greatest product of the world, because human had wisdom and could inherit. Human had the instinct to fight against and even break the fundamental rules of the world. That kind of will was so stubborn and powerful that it could be called desire. Therefore, the human world and Haotian would inevitably go against each other until there was a winner. In the past history of the world, Haotian won countless times, and the human world ushered in countless long nights. The inherited wisdom withered in the cold eternal night. But the human world would always revive and challenge again. It was daytime now, so the sky was naturally white. The snowflakes falling from the sky were also white. The Vermilion Bird Avenue in the wind and snow was pure white. The accumulated blood on the street gradually turned black. The Tangs lying in the pool of blood were all wearing dark clothes. The bricks, iron pots and chamber pots scattered on the street were all dirty and black. Since Haotian chose white, the human world chose black. The world became black and white in Ning Ke's eyes. Light and darkness, holiness and filth. The black and white world became an extremely simple picture in his eyes. It became two absolutely parallel lines, looking at each other coldly and unwilling to get close. The two lines were shortened and then they had a length. Ning Ke was very familiar with this picture. It was the first divine talisman he learned, the two horizontal talisman. Then, one of the lines suddenly deflected and stabbed into the other line. This was the second divine talisman he learned last night by the lake, the E talisman. When the two lines touched, the two worlds were connected, but they could not merge and began to have a fierce conflict. A piercingly cold cutting intent, as if it wanted to cut open the entire space. Different from Master Yen Sei's Jing Fu, which had its own rules and its own calm area, the E Fu spread around endlessly, just like weeds growing fiercely. The E talisman was very powerful. Besides cutting, the two worlds could be connected. It had a kind of endless meaning, representing the balance between the human world and Haotian. But this was not what Ning Ke wanted, nor was it what Chang'an needed now. Looking at the E talisman on the snowy street, he seemed to see countless weeds or two dry sticks of firewood, or even a chopper stuck in the fertile plains. The two firewood could not be put together firmly, and one of the firewood slowly collapsed. A hand grasped the handle, trying to pull the chopper out of the field. Suddenly, a stone with moss appeared in the weeds. It was the stone at the bottom of the Daming Lake in front of the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. When youngest uncle broke the stone array tactics, he cut 2 sword marks on each stone. 2 sword marks, 1 word. Ning Ke really woke up. He was familiar with this situation. He had similar experiences when he saw the sword marks left by youngest uncle at the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine, and when he faced the stone statue of the Venerable in the Lank Temple. Today he meditated on the snowy street for a short time, but he gained a lot. Even if some of them could not be used by him now, they would become the most precious treasures on his cultivation path as long as he could survive. He knew something had happened. Then he heard Uncle Chow say, F*CKU. Then he heard the Abbey Dean ask eldest brother, "Has heaven ever spared anyone?" He had heard this sentence before. At the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine, Lotus had asked him the same question. At that time, his answer was, "Man can conquer heaven, and there is no need for heaven to spare him." But today he did not want to answer like this. There were hundreds of old, weak women and children between him and the Abbey Dean. For him, these old, weak women and children were thousands of people. Passing through the thousands of people, he looked into the Abbey Dean's eyes and said, "If heaven does not obey, then just destroy it." Compared with his answer to Lotus years ago, his answer today was calmer and more certain. It was not because he had the confidence to defeat the Abbey Dean, nor was it because he wanted to show his arrogance. It was because he had really thought through the truth, so he was calm. Because if heaven did not obey the will of man, then the only way was to destroy heaven. No matter whether he would win or lose, he had to do it. Because This was the truth of the academy. After saying this, he held the hilt and was ready to pull the padao out from the ground. With this movement, the slowly rotating liquid in his abdomen suddenly exploded and sprayed everywhere. The Great Spirit grew wildly like weeds, shaking its waist. Chang and City sensed the change on the snowy street. Endless chi of heaven and earth fell with the wind and snow, and poured into his body through the array pestle. His aura suddenly changed and began to climb toward the peak of the knowing destiny state. Note, the dog at home is sick and is urinating blood. It has been running outside for a whole day. I'm not complaining but updating very late. I want to explain to you. I will continue to write the second chapter. I hope I can finish it before 2 o'clock. In addition, I strongly feel that the chapters in the second volume of Being Possessed by the Devil are worth revisiting. About Ning Ke teaching Sang Sang, do your own thing. This is a sentence my niece's kindergarten teacher taught her when she was young. At that time, whenever I wanted to help her with something, she always told me seriously, do your own thing and vice versa. I love her very much and I miss her very much. My dear, I know you will see this. Please say hello to your classmates for me. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 803. The chi of heaven and earth in Chang'an was so vast that it could not be calculated. At this moment, it was pouring into Ning Ke's body through the array pestle along his left hand. The chi of heaven and earth had no substance or quality. It was clearer than the clearest water and lighter than the lightest air. But there was too much of it entering his body, which naturally brought him an unbearable burden. If an ordinary person, even a cultivator at the peak of the knowing destiny state, had absorbed so much chi of heaven and earth in such a short period of time, he would have been crushed to death. But Ning Ke cultivated the Great Spirit and his body was stronger than steel. Except for the Abbé Dean who cultivated the Taoism, Buddhism and the Devil's Doctrine, and third sister Yu Lian who was the leader of the Devil's Doctrine, no one was stronger than him. His body was like a container made of stainless steel, which was used to make the primordial 13 arrows. It withstood the chi of heaven and earth and compressed it to an unimaginable degree. At this moment he was like a seashell in the depths of the sea. His body and soul were under terrible pressure, but he did not know when they could condense into dazzling pearls. It was a very painful process. But he showed no expression on his face, except for his eyelashes that kept blinking and the snow on his clothes that kept melting. He just looked at the Abbé Dean. The wounds on his body opened up again and blood gushed out. The blood was like red jade and when it came into contact with the cold wind on the street, it dispersed into extremely fine particles. Those particles left the surface of his clothes and drifted in the air around him. They looked like flames or fog. He looked like a burning man or an extremely cold man of ice. He continued to pull out his cutlass. The sharp blade slowly rose from the bluestone cracks on the Vermilion Bird Avenue, bringing out black mud and was about to leave the snow. Many things happened in Chang'an. In the early morning the Abbé Dean waved his sleeves to break the stone array tactics, entered the city, and defeated the eldest brother and third sister of the academy. Then many divine talismans appeared in front of him, telling him that it was a dead end. From that moment until he saw the Abbé Dean in the wind and snow on the Vermilion Bird Avenue, Ning Ke went to many places in Chang'an and erased many traces left by Haotian in the God-stunning array. Though he didn't completely repair the God-stunning array, he left behind enough divine talismans. Those divine talismans were formed by 2 knife marks, which looked like the Chinese character D. These divine talismans put the Abbé Dean in a difficult position. They prevented him from entering the imperial palace and destroying the array of the God-stunning array. They forced him to walk into the wind and snow on the Vermilion Bird Avenue and kill Ning Ke first. Ning Ke was seriously injured by the 7 natural stream magical fingers. He did not continue to write the Talisman of Yi because it was meaningless. However, the hundreds of talismans he wrote did not disappear. Instead, they continued to float in the streets and alleys of Chang'an, and under the support of the God-stunning array and gradually disappeared into the wind and snow. As he unsheathed his sword, hundreds of talismans reappeared. On the street at the end of the alley. In the well in front of the yamen. Behind the wall in the garden. Under the willows beside the plum trees. Hundreds of talismans reappeared in Chang'an. Inconceivably, these divine talismans were still changing. To be precise, these talismans were changing shape. These talismans were formed by 2 knife marks, which were 2 strokes. 1 stroke and 1 stroke. As Ning Ke unsheathed his sword, the stroke slowly rose to the right, as if it was going to float away from the stroke. This stroke was like an arrow. The invisible bowstring was pulled back farther and farther away from the bow, and at the same time, it was accumulating more and more power. It was also like a knife that was leaving the ground and was about to show its sharpness. Unsheathing a sword was a very simple action. Ning Ke had repeated it countless times in his life. He was very familiar with it, so he finished it in a very short time. The changes in the streets and alleys of Chang'an also happened in a very short time. The situation suddenly changed. The first person to feel the changes in Ning Ke and Chang'an was not the Abbey Dean eldest brother, or the people on the snowy street. It was the sky above their heads. The water at the bottom of the well at the entrance of the alley had long been frozen. Suddenly 2 knife marks appeared. 2 knife marks appeared on the snow-covered bell, and 2 knife marks appeared on the Yanming Lake. The water in the well began to ripple again, and so did the sound of the bell. The willow branches by the Yanming Lake began to sway in the cold wind. Thick snow fell from the pine trees in the Tantua temple. A fat squirrel sat on the food for the winter under its buttocks and kept rubbing its forelimbs. It did not understand why it was frozen before. The aura that enveloped the lakes, mountains, pagodas and temples instantly disappeared as hundreds of each talismans reappeared and changed shape. Even the falling snow suddenly stopped, and the frozen Chang'an came back to life. The unknown aura continued to spread around with Ning Ke's action. At the same time, it rushed to the sky, wildly dispersing the thick snow clouds. The blue sky reappeared. When the headmaster of the academy left the human world, the Abbey Dean was the first in the world. The sky was the first to feel this change and he was the second to feel it. He sensed the danger. His eyes suddenly became lighter than gray, until they were transparent, like crystals. There were countless lights and shadows moving at a high speed in them, as if many stories were happening on the screen. He saw some scenes that he could not believe. In Chang'an, the Abbey Dean could not see the future clearly, just as he could not see what the academy would become in the future. However, he once saw some scenes that he firmly believed. But those scenes changed. At the moment when Ning Ke pulled out his knife, the snow stopped and the wind stopped. The Vermilion Bird Avenue was very quiet. The Abbey Dean looked at Ning Quebec. His eyes returned to normal, but there was a touch of surprise left behind. He believed in Taoism and he had no love or hate for things like killing. Today the Abbey Dean had killed countless people. He had his reasons and his needs. He wanted to kill Ning Ke previously because of his needs. However, he wanted to kill Ning Ke now because of an inexplicable vigilance. This vigilance was so strong that it even caused his Tao heart to sway slightly. He wanted to kill Ning Quebec. This desire was almost an instinct. But he sensed that there was something hidden in the air between him and Ning Quebec. He could not enter the limitless state, so he could not kill Ning Ke in the shortest time. So he could not let Ning Ke raise that knife at least. The Abbey Dean looked at Ning Ke and said, "Those who believe in..." Ning Ke did not know why he spoke at this time. The disciples of the academy in front of the Verdant Canyon would definitely think of the West Hill scriptures that the great divine priest of Revelation had read. It was the Taoist divine skill that was as famous as the Shenkong Temple's chief preaching monk's words. Ning Ke did not die. Because the Abbey Dean only had time to say these 3 words. Because eldest brother said these 3 words at the same time, Z does not speak. After saying these 3 words, his face suddenly turned pale, and more blood flowed out of his cotton-padded jacket. Ning Ke finally pulled out his knife after such a short delay. The blade completely left the snow. Looking at the knife in his hand, the Abbey Dean took a step back. Retreating meant leaving. For thousands of years, he was the only one who had killed his way into Chang'an. He was about to destroy the God-stunning array, the Tang Empire and the Academy, and achieve a great achievement. As long as he could kill Ning Ke, he could achieve all of this. For the Abbey Dean, this was a very simple thing and naturally a great temptation. But he wanted to leave. Without any hesitation, without any reluctance. Only a person with a truly bright Taoist heart could do this. There was no wind or snow on the street. The Abbey Dean could not move forward, so he stepped back. His right foot stepped on the ground and wind and snow appeared under his foot. An invisible door appeared in the wind and snow. The door could only be seen by people in the limitless state. The Abbey Dean's right foot stepped into the door, and his indigo robe suddenly became transparent. The next moment he was about to step into the void. The chi of heaven and earth in Chang'an had been disturbed by Ning Ke, but it still could not stop him from leaving. Ning Ke was not going to let him leave. Because he had already pulled out his knife. When the blade left the snow, it made a very faint sound, like a brush dipped in oil brushing across a piece of meat that had been roasted over a bonfire, or like a brush dipped in ink sliding across a snow-white paper. Hundreds of soft sounds were heard in the streets and alleys of Chang'an, and beside the willows and plum trees. It was like the sound of a zither, like the sound of a bowstring, and most like the sound of a blade being unsheathed. That was the sound of friction between the skimming and pressing. It was the sound of hundreds of talismans. Then there were more sounds of blades being unsheathed. This time it was a real sound. Dozens of pig slaughtering knives hanging on the wall of the Eastern City pork shop had been lonely in their leather sheaths for a day and a night. Suddenly they broke out of their sheaths. Not far from Vermilion Bird Avenue, there was a sharp knife stabbed into a chopping board in a certain house. The knife was stained with fresh blood. Not far away there was a pot of stewed meat steaming. Suddenly the kitchen knife jumped out of the chopping board. Two teenagers were lying in a pool of blood beside the Vermilion Bird Avenue. They were seriously injured and leaned against the wall that was wet with snow. Although they were not dead, they could no longer hold the knives and forks beside them. Suddenly the two choppers and the kitchen knife jumped out of the snow and landed beside their hands. Ning Ke pulled out his knife. All the knives in Chang'an were pulled out. Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of knives began to show their sharpness. The winter willows by the Yanming Lake were fluttering. The pine trees in the Tantua Temple were bowing. The snow on the whetstone floated up. One of the lines among the hundreds of divine talismans moved very slightly. The snow on the long street was blurred and countless sharp auras suddenly appeared. The invisible door was cut into pieces in an instant. Countless tiny cracks appeared on the Abbé Dean's indigo robe. Many cracks also appeared on his powerful body that was forged from the heavenly demon realm. The Abbé Dean began to bleed, a lot of blood. Ning Ke raised his knife and said, "I want to kill you." As he spoke, the absolutely condensed chi of heaven and earth spurted out from his lips and turned into a half-foot-long white mist. There were tiny flashes of thunder and lightning in the mist, as well as his strong desire. 2 more chapters tomorrow? To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 804. Ning Ke didn't say, "I want to kill you." Instead, he said, "I want to kill you." He seemed very careful. But his calmness and prudence showed that he really wanted to do it. Because this was the desire of everyone in Chang'an City. He wanted to fulfill this desire, so he said that sentence very seriously, and at the same time he issued his own call or request. As if hearing his call, a loud and clear chirp suddenly sounded in the south of the street. The wind and snow on the Vermilion Bird Avenue had stopped, but the snow was still there. The vermilion bird painting, which had frightened Ning Ke and Sang Sang in the spring rain, was now buried in the deep snow, as if it had been frozen and lifeless. The vermilion bird painting was the killing talisman of the god-stunning array. It had an unimaginable spirituality. When it operated on its own, it could have the most powerful strike of a powerhouse at the peak of knowing destiny. 1,000 years ago, it was carved by the headmaster in the south of the Vermilion Bird Avenue to guard this great capital. Countless demons and evil spirits were quietly burned to ashes by it in the dark night. When the Abbé Dean entered Chang'an, the vermilion bird painting sensed him. When it was about to show itself to fight, the Abbé Dean stepped on its wings. It was just a simple step, but it didn't dare to move. Because the vermilion bird sensed the gap between their states, it felt scared. So it lowered its once proud head and buried itself in the cold snow, too ashamed to see anyone. Until then, a voice suddenly came to the deepest part of its soul. The voice said that he wanted to kill the Abbé Dean, so he needed its help. The vermilion bird knew who the voice was, but it couldn't think of anyone who could kill someone like the Abbé Dean after the headmaster left the human world. So it was still timid. But the voice kept echoing in the deepest part of its soul, rubbing against it and burning it like surging magma. It was so irritated that even its blood started to burn. The timidity from a moment ago turned into shame. Something called courage returned to the vermilion bird. The snow was blown away by the wind, revealing its eyes. A majestic aura rose on the street. The wings of the vermilion bird painting broke through the snow and stones and appeared in the sky. With an extremely clear cry, the vermilion bird's body left the street and soared into the sky. The vermilion bird hadn't chirped for 1,000 years. Would today's cry be able to shock the gods? The vermilion bird spread its 100 feet long wings and flew across the sky, arriving at the south gate of Chang'an in an instant. The city walls towered into the clouds and the bricks were old. The vermilion bird flew between the city walls. It flapped its scarlet wings as if dragging 2 flames behind it. It stuck close to the city wall and flew at high speed. In an extremely short amount of time, it arrived in the north. The vermilion bird flew above the imperial palace. The empress held the little emperor's hand and bowed slightly to the sky. Yu Lian raised an eyebrow in the corner tower of the royal city. The vermilion bird flew over the imperial palace, lowered its altitude, and dove south along Vermilion Bird Avenue. This world's straightest and widest road was its path. The vermilion bird flew extremely fast on this road. Its wings, which were more than 100 feet long, seemed to be setting Chang and on fire. Wherever it touched, the snow suddenly turned into smoke. No one on the snowy street could react. They only heard a clear sound, and then they saw a fiery shadow approaching. No one had time to think, not even the Abbé Dean. When he saw clearly that it was the vermilion bird flying on the street, he could not help but show a mocking expression. The Abbé Dean rarely showed emotions like ordinary people, but he could never suppress his mockery and contempt for the legendary vermilion bird. Even he himself could not figure out the reason. Perhaps it was because the vermilion bird was the only thing left by the headmaster in the human world. The vermilion bird flew on the snowy street, flapping its wings. The blazing flames burned the air and made a crackling sound. The whole world seemed to turn into a fiery red color. Just when the Tangs were expecting the vermilion bird to kill the Abbé Dean, and the Abbé Dean was about to tear off the vermilion bird's fiery wings, the vermilion bird gave a clear cry again. A flame flashed. The vermilion bird quietly withdrew its aura, turned into a flame and fell on Ning Kei's cutlass. There was a slight burning sound as if a soldering iron had been stamped somewhere. Ning Kei's cutlass had some black burn marks and a very distinct pattern. It was a firebird with a bright red body. Ning Kei's iron cutlass was the combination of the 3 cutlasses that had accompanied him for many years. Just like the primordial 13 arrows, it was the crystallization of the collective wisdom of the Academy, possessing unimaginable strength and weight. Only such a strong cutlass could withstand the great power in his body. However, with the improvement of his cultivation realm, this saber was not as useful to him as the 3 sabers he had in the past, the primordial 13 arrows, and the inexhaustible talisman paper. Sometimes, it even became his weakness. Ning Kei was very good at fighting. He clearly knew how troublesome it was to be unable to balance the weapon in his hand with his own strength. But he never gave up on this cutlass. Because in the darkness, he always felt that this blade should belong to him, and that one day, it would reveal its true sharpness. When this cutlass was made, he even refused 4th brother's and 6th brother's suggestion to carve talismans on the cutlass to increase its power like most of the powerful cultivators in the world did. Because he felt that the talismans he wrote back then were not powerful enough. Using them on the iron cutlass was equivalent to destroying the cutlass. Even though he could write divine talismans now, he still felt that it was not enough. There was no reason. He just felt that the talisman that was qualified to be carved on this cutlass must be extraordinary. So the iron cutlass had always been dim, without any talisman lines carved on it. The heavy cutlass looked so simple and unadorned, but it was constantly soaked in blood. Until today, with a clear cry from the south of Chang'an, the vermilion bird broke through the sky and turned into a flame falling on the cutlass. Then a bright red pattern appeared on the black cutlass. Ning Kei then realized that it was what he had been waiting for. He then understood why the headmaster of the academy let him meet the vermilion bird before he left the human world. It must be an extraordinary talisman that matched this iron cutlass. This talisman was the vermilion bird. It was the killing talisman in the god-stunning array. The cutlass had been pulled out of the snow. Ning Kei raised the cutlass and the snow suddenly scattered. The vermilion bird divine talisman on the black cutlass suddenly lit up. A bright red flame spurted out from the edge of the cutlass, piercing the sky. At this time, the wind and snow had long disappeared, and the blue sky was revealed to countless eyes in the human world. The bright red flame that the cutlass spurted out was more than 10 miles long. As Ning Kei raised the cutlass, it dragged from the northeast to the southwest in the blue sky. As the flames dragged on, a mark was left in the blue sky. It was as if someone had taken a mountain-like brush and written heavily in the sky. This stroke crossed half of the sky and no one knew how many thousands of miles. Ning Kei lowered the cutlass and the flame from the blade moved down. He began to write the second stroke. In the corner tower of the imperial city, Yu Lian looked at the sky quietly, watching the flame moving between the sky and the earth. Then she glanced at the cutlass in her hand. It was a huge blood-red cutlass, even as long and wide as her petite body. This blood-red cutlass was the sacred relic of the Devil's Doctrine. After the desolate men moved south, it had been kept by Tang Xiaotang. As the Grandmaster of the Devil's Doctrine, it was natural for Yu Lian to have this cutlass. When the Abbé Dean walked on the snowy street, she came to the imperial palace for this cutlass. Judging from its appearance, the blood-colored giant blade in her hand was definitely more terrifying than the one in Ning Kei's hand, and it gave people a stronger sense of deterrence. But she knew that compared to the one in Ning Kei's hand, her blood cutlass was inferior. Ning Kei's cutlass could write in the sky. You finally wrote that word. Yu Lian looked at the word that was gradually taking shape in the blue sky, and suddenly took a deep breath. The snow around the imperial city floated up from the ground as she breathed. The ice in the moat cracked and broke into countless pieces. Air poured into her petite body between her breaths. Her chest rose and fell slightly. Her eyes gradually brightened. Everyone on the snowy street was looking at the sky. Everyone in Chong'an was looking at the sky. They were looking at the giant brush formed by flames, riding in the blue sky. Eldest brother was also looking at the sky. There was no snow falling, but his eyes were a little wet. He looked at the sky and said quietly, "Teacher, youngest brother finally wrote that word." Then he took a deep breath. Nothing changed on the snowy street. Even the withered leaves that fell on the snow did not tremble a bit during his breath. His eyes gradually brightened. His cotton-padded jacket continued to ooze blood. The wooden ladle broke in front of the Pamir Mountains. The wooden stick was held in his hand. He did not know where he put the old book. The belt on the cotton-padded jacket no longer needed to be tied with so many things and worries. So it began to float, drawing many residual shadows. Ning Kei looked at the Abbey Dean and cut. Because the cutlass in his hand was bound to fall on the Abbey Dean. So he had to cut more accurately. His eyes met with the Abbey Dean's in the street. He did not see any other emotions in the Abbey Dean's eyes, only calmness. The snowflakes floating in the air also became calm. The extremely faint sound of the snow pressing against each other began to become muffled. Time began to slow down. Then he heard the Abbey Dean's voice in his sense of perception. "Your strokes are wrong." Ning Kei was not worried. Because no one could really control the rules of time except for the Buddha. Not even the Abbey Dean. Even if he slowed down time with his great divine power, he was still in the process of slowing down time. That meant no matter how slow the iron cutlass fell, it would reach the moment eventually. He said to the Abbey Dean, "The strokes are wrong, but it doesn't mean the words are wrong." The Abbey Dean's voice disappeared for a moment and then sounded again. His voice was full of emotion and complicated emotions. "Good writing. There is one more chapter. I will continue. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 805. I never understood why the headmaster accepted you as his last disciple. Although you had many adventures and entered the knowing destiny state early, which is indeed extraordinary for ordinary cultivators in the world, you are not even as good as my son Pippi, let alone Li Man, Jun Mo and Lin Wu. What right do you have to be the last trace left by the headmaster in the human world? The Abbey Dean said, "It was not until you wrote this word that I realized the headmaster was the headmaster after all." He had never made a wrong choice other than being Hao Yan's enemy. At this time the snow on the street was like a lead ball, slowly falling. Time was still moving very slowly. Ning Kei listened to the voice in his sense of perception and naturally thought of his headmaster who was still fighting in the sky. The Abbey Dean looked at Ning Quebec. At first he was ready to kill him. But when he saw Ning Kei take out the cutlass, he decided to kill him. At least he could not let Ning Kei take out the cutlass. When Ning Kei took out the cutlass he wanted to retreat, but he was trapped by countless cutlasses in Chang'an. When the vermilion bird attached to the iron cutlass and Ning Kei started to write the big word in the sky, he decided to choose another way out. The state gap between him and Ning Kei was too big. Even if Ning Kei could write that word, he might not be able to defeat him. The real reason why he decided to retreat at all costs was because of what he saw. Earlier he saw a deep dark night. It's a pity that the stroke order of the word is wrong and you can't finish it in time. Then when I want to leave, no one can stop me. The Abbey Dean said and then opened his arms solemnly, as if he was welcoming something. As he moved, the speed of time on the snow street returned to normal. The Abbey Dean's fingers trembled in the cold wind. 3 of his fingers on his left hand had been cut off by Yu Lian's cicada wings. At this time he opened his arms to embrace the sky, and only 7 fingers remained in the sky. They were the 7 Tianqi. The majestic power and tranquil light fell on the snow street, on the Abbey Dean, or more precisely on his fingers. 7 rays of clear light fell on his fingers. The clear light fell on the fingers and suddenly changed. The clear light on the Abbey Dean's right thumb turned red, the clear light on the index finger turned orange, and the clear light on the other fingers also changed colors. red, orange, yellow, green, cyan, blue and purple. When the 7 heavenly lights combined, they became a rainbow. A rainbow appeared in Chang'an. One end of the rainbow was on the snowy street, rising steeply from the ground, reaching extremely high into the sky. Then, it drew a perfectly round arc, landing somewhere outside the city. This rainbow contained unimaginable power. The street shook uneasily, and the bluestone slabs cracked inch by inch. The people who were standing fell to the ground one after another. The remaining snow and dirty water were all shaken into powder. The Abbey Dean's figure disappeared from the snowy street. He flew with the wind and arrived in the sky along the rainbow. The sky was very big. Although the word written by Ning Ke with the vermilion bird blade was also very big, it could not occupy the entire sky, leaving enough space for the rainbow. His saber had not chopped down, and he had not finished writing the word in the blue sky. His blade carried the longing of millions of people, and this longing was extremely heavy. Perhaps it was because of this heaviness that it was somewhat slow. And the Abbey Dean was about to step on the rainbow and go thousands of miles away. This was a great divine ability. The sky was huge, really huge. No matter how great a bird was, it was impossible to fly across the entire sky. No matter how far one's vision was, it was impossible to see the end of the sky. There were countless cuts and talisman intents in the city. The chi of heaven and earth was already in disorder. It was difficult for the Abbey Dean to leave. Therefore he came to the sky, thinking that no one could stop him. But the sky was also very small, so small that birds would sometimes collide with each other. It was so small that people who lived under the sky sometimes found it difficult to breathe. A hand appeared in the sky and held the Abbey Dean's foot. The hand was very clean and the nails were also very clean. There was no blood or dirt. The hand was very steady and firm as if it was playing the zither. There was no trembling at all. It was the eldest brother's hand. In the wilderness, Sang Sang was summoned by Hao Yin's divine kingdom and gradually floated to the sky. Ning Ke held her waist and followed her to leave the human world. The headmaster stood on the ground and reached out to hold his foot. He reached out to hold the Abbey Dean's hand because he did not want him to leave. The eldest brother did not want the Abbey Dean to leave either. He and the Abbey Dean had been chasing each other in the human world for 7 days and 7 nights. How could he let the Abbey Dean go when the end was near? He was the eldest brother of the academy. He looked gentle and dull, but he had real wisdom. He had a pure heart. He knew the Abbey Dean's real state and the Taoist heart of the Abbey Dean better than Ning Quebec. He knew that the Abbey Dean would leave at all costs after Ning Ke wrote that word. Therefore he was prepared in advance. He took a breath. The withered leaves did not tremble. Only the belt around his waist fluttered. That was the sign of entering the limitless state. When the Abbey Dean stepped on the rainbow and flew to the blue sky, he chased after him. He had never been so close to the blue sky, nor so far from the earth. He reached the blue sky with the limitless state, but he might not be able to return to the earth safely. He chased after the Abbey Dean with his life, again and again. The eldest brother was not the only one who was prepared in advance. Yulian was also prepared. She stood in the turret of the imperial palace and looked at the word that was gradually completed in the blue sky. She took a deep breath. As she breathed, the snow and ice cracked. Countless chilly air poured into her body. Then all the air was spat out from between her lips. The air rubbed against each other at high speed, making a heart-palpitating scream. She bent her knees slightly and sent all the strength in her body to her feet. In the rumbling sound, the sturdy turret collapsed. Smoke and dust filled the air. A petite figure broke through the smoke and flew straight to the blue sky like a stone thrown out by a catapult. She came to the blue sky. Against the backdrop of the vast sky, her figure seemed especially petite. The blood-red machete in her hand was still so ridiculously huge. The blood-red machete chopped down toward the rainbow. The blade and the rainbow collided. Golden and jade-like chips flew out. Although the blood-red machete was a sacred relic of the devil's doctrine, it was still rapidly eroded when contending against the pure Tianqi light. There was a crisp sound of paper being torn. The blood-red machete turned into an iron rod. The rainbow bridge connecting Chang and city broke in the middle and began to collapse. The Abbey Dean fell from the blue sky. The eldest brother was still holding the Abbey Dean's foot. Yulian also began to fall. Like 3 meteorites, there was a loud rumbling sound. The 3 landed on the snow street. The remaining snow suddenly scattered and the smoke and dust rose. Vaguely, it could be seen that Yulian was holding the eldest brother in her arms. If not, the eldest brother would have been killed by the earthquake falling from the sky, no matter how high his state was. However, even though she was the current grandmaster of the Devil's Doctrine and possessed unimaginable strength and physical strength, she was still seriously injured by such a terrible impact in protecting the eldest brother. Blood flowed from her ankle. She might have broken a bone. The Abbey Dean was indeed the most powerful person in Taoism for 1,000 years. He fell from the sky as if nothing had happened. He reached out and cast another Tianqi. A majestic power fell from the sky. Yu Lian turned her jade-like hands and 2 transparent cicada wings appeared on the snow street. The power of Tianqi bombarded the cicada wings. There was a crisp crack. Yu Lian's wrists were all broken. It was an unbearable pain, but she was still expressionless and kept holding the sky with one hand. The eldest brother was dying. She had to hold up the sky. Killing the Abbey Dean in Chang and was what the academy wanted and had to do. In the original plan, the eldest brother and she had made Ning Ke should repair the God-stunning array and at least trap the Abbey Dean in a specific position. Then she and the eldest brother would burn their lives to launch the strongest attack. However, things never went according to plan. Ning Ke could not repair the God-stunning array in time. The Abbey Dean was more powerful than the academy had imagined. Fortunately, Ning Ke could write that character now. Then what the eldest brother and Yu Lian needed to do was to trap the Abbey Dean and leave the chance for Ning Ke to kill him. A rainbow fell. The Abbey Dean went straight up to the sky, and then fell to the dust. Ning Ke's cutlass finally arrived. The iron cutlass was very black, and the vermilion bird pattern was dark red. The vermilion bird was the full power of the knowing destiny state. At this time, the chi of heaven and earth in Chang and entered Ning Ke's body through the array eye pestle and then transferred to the iron cutlass. The power of the cutlass had already surpassed the 5 states. A hurricane suddenly rose on the snow street. The cutlass wind was everywhere. All the debris on the street was rolled up by the cutlass wind and chopped toward the Abbey Dean. The view on the street became dark. The Abbey Dean's figure suddenly faded away and disappeared. Only the sound of wind and collision could be heard. Countless sharp cutlasses broke through the air. The chi of heaven and earth generated countless dangerous turbulence, and some places even had large-scale distortions. Every distortion was like a mirror. Knives could be seen in some mirrors. A faint figure could be seen in some mirrors. A cyan Taoist robe could be seen in some mirrors. A piece of the cyan robe fell on the street. The Abbey Dean landed on the street. He was covered in blood, and no one knew how many cutlasses had cut him. Blood was flowing and there were countless cuts. Some of the cuts were deep, some were shallow, and the shapes were different. The flesh on some parts of his body was almost cut off, revealing the ghastly white bones. He looked extremely miserable. Ning Ke's cutlass penetrated all the chi of heaven and earth. No matter where the Abbey Dean was hiding, he would be cut out by Ning Quebec. When the cutlass reached his body, the Abbey Dean used the boundless state of the Buddhism sect, just like the previous 2 times. However, this time was different from the previous 2 times. Because Ning Ke had more than one cutlass. He borrowed a cutlass from everyone in Chang'an City. All the cutlasses in Chang'an City fell on the Abbey Dean. The sea was boundless and the number of cutlasses was innumerable. The Abbey Dean killed thousands of people on this street. Therefore he was cut into pieces on this street. He let out an extremely shrill and mournful scream. He was in extreme pain. "Old master, I didn't embarrass you. The person who embarrassed me was Qin Mao. He was in pain." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 806. In the roar, the Abbey Dean came to Ning Quebec. Every step on the snow street was stained with blood. Yu Lian cut off the rainbow bridge and eldest brother held his feet. He could not leave Chang'an City by air, so he had to take Ning Ke's blade. At this moment he was as miserable as a sinner who had been sentenced to death by dismemberment. He was covered with blood and bones, but he still thought he could take the blade. The Abbey Dean was still flying like an immortal, a white bone immortal. He pointed at the blade. He looked solemn, like a king of the divine kingdom walking in the human world. His aura suddenly changed and became extremely awe-inspiring. An aura colder than the abyss and lonelier than death passed from his fingertips to the blade of the iron cutlass. In an instant, the blade was covered with a layer of frost. What a strong aura of quietus. The vermilion bird let out an angry roar and spewed out endless flames to fight against the quietus. The front end of the iron cutlass was colder than ice, emitting a terrifying quietus aura. It was covered with frost, while the other end near Ning Ke's right hand was extremely hot, emitting flames to the outside world. Two extreme auras were making the most dangerous resistance on such a simple and plain cutlass. No one knew if the iron cutlass would be frozen into scrap iron or burn all the quietus in the world in the next moment. At this moment, a clear sound was heard in the hurricane that the iron cutlass stirred up on the snow street. It was the sound of metal objects colliding, and then more and more colliding sounds were heard. The wind of the cutlass swept through the street and surged between the streets and markets. No one knew how many things were rolled up, such as iron pots, broken gongs, and musical instruments like flutes. The gongs were hit by stones, the thick iron pots hit the walls, and the flutes started to whimper due to the wind. There were lively sounds in the dim wind, and no one knew who was having a wedding or a funeral. With these sounds, the frost on the front end of the iron cutlass disappeared at a speed visible to the naked eye, while the flame spewed by the vermilion bird cut toward the Abbey Dean along the blade. The quietus was broken by the bustle of the human world. The fierce wind set up by the iron cutlass turned the vermilion bird avenue into the storm sea in the east of the Song Kingdom. The Abbey Dean's quietus aura was broken, and his indigo robe fluttered in the wind. He stood up ostentatiously, and his body seemed to become countless times bigger. An aura as vast and boundless as the sea appeared on the snowy street. The Abbey Dean used the boundless sea of the Buddhism sect again. The pain of being dismembered made him very clear that if he only used the boundless state of the Buddhism sect, it would not be enough to resist the knife in Ning Kei's hand, because there were thousands of knives. Therefore he used the divine demon realm at the same time. The divine demon realm was a unique skill of the devil's doctrine. Apart from Yu Lian, only the Abbey Dean knew it. Apart from making the body of a cultivator stronger than steel, more importantly, it could create a new world, or in other words, a false world. What would happen if the Buddhist sect's limitless and the devil sect's sky demon realm were used at the same time? Ning Kei came to the coast of the East Sea and stood on the seawall that stretched for miles. The East Sea Causeway of the Kingdom of Song was very famous. He didn't look at the strangely shaped rocks under his feet. Instead, he looked silently at the seemingly boundless sea outside the causeway. There were countless storms in the depths of the sea. The seawater nearby was stirred like ink, with a chilling sense of danger. Waves as high as a 10-story building were set off in the distance. Ning Kei did not slash at the waves, because the Abbey Dean was not a storm. The storm came from his iron cutlass. The Abbey Dean was the sea. No matter how terrible the storm was, it could never destroy the sea itself. The vermilion bird chirped in the gloomy sky. Holding a small stone in its mouth, the little red bird flew to the depths of the sea against the storm. No matter how violent the storm was, it could not be stopped. The vermilion bird became a little black dot in the sky. It took the small stone in its mouth and threw it into the sea. The stone fell into the raging sea and was swallowed instantly. It did not even make a noticeable splash. The vermilion bird was not discouraged. It chirped and flew back to the shore. Holding another stone in its mouth, it flew to the depths of the sea against the storm. The bird shuttled back and forth between the gloomy sky and the raging sea. Behind the seawall, more than half of a mountain had collapsed. At the foot of the mountain there were people hammering at the rocks. The hard rocks were smashed to the size of the vermilion bird's mouth. There were many people smashing stones, so many that it was hard to count. Many of them came from the Hua Mountain. In recent years they had smashed the collapsed Buddha statues into countless small Buddha statues and sold them to tourists. They were good at this kind of thing. Human beings were good at this kind of thing. Human beings were good at cutting mountains and smashing all the hard things in the world. Behind the sea wall, the dull sound of smashing stones kept ringing for many days and nights. People smashed stones tirelessly, and the vermilion bird flew back and forth between the sea and the land tirelessly. Countless small stones were thrown into the sea by the vermilion bird. This was reclamation. The sea was immeasurable. But as long as it kept filling, it would be filled up one day. The immeasurable was broken by the immeasurable of the human world. The Abbey Dean became a barren field. It had been raining heavily for half a year. It was said that the flood was a punishment from Haotian. Anyone who disrespected Haotian would die in this terrible disaster. If one wanted to avoid the flood, he had to walk through the wilderness. However, the wilderness was covered with knee-high weeds and muddy marshes. Some places seemed safe, but dangerous quicksand was hidden. Even the most ferocious beasts did not dare to walk in the wilderness. The first person came to the periphery of the wilderness. He was hesitant because there was no road in the wilderness. He did not know how to walk and what was the right way. More and more people came to the wilderness. They wanted to walk through the wilderness and find a new world. However, like the first person, they did not know where the road was. They discussed for a long time and even began to quarrel, but they could not come up with an idea. Please make way. A young man squeezed through the crowd and walked into the wilderness. His luggage was simple. The only useful thing was probably the rusty chopper in his hand. What was more worrying was that he was carrying a skinny little girl on his back. People tried to persuade him that it was dangerous in the wilderness. The most important thing was that there was no road. The young man ignored them and continued to walk into the wilderness. He only held the chopper in his hand tighter. Looking at the back of the young man disappearing in the weeds of the wilderness, the crowd was silent for a long time. Someone tightened the luggage on his back and followed him into the wilderness. Someone supported his tired body with a branch and also walked in. More and more people walked into the wilderness. Some were bitten to death by the poisonous snakes in the swamp, some sank into the depths of the quagmire, and some became dried corpses under the quicksand. However, there were even more people who successfully walked through the wilderness and went to a new world. There was no road in the world. As long as more people walked, there would be a road. The divine demon realm was broken by the persistence of the human world. The Abbey Dean displayed 3 states at the same time: the nirvana of Taoism, the immeasurable of Buddhism, and the divine demon realm of Devil's doctrine. These 3 states were all above the 5 states. Ning Ke simply chopped. One chop broke them all. The Abbey Dean's finger was still on the blade. The snow and frost on the iron blade had disappeared. The momentum of the blade and the blazing flame were gone with the wind. There was a thin cut on the Abbey Dean's finger. Then more than 10 extremely miserable cuts appeared on his body. Some of the flesh that had been cut was blown away by the wind, while others drooped outwards, exposed to the dusky wind. Blood flowed down from his body like a waterfall. He looked very miserable. He looked so miserable that it was impossible for him to live. But the Abbey Dean was still alive. The most powerful person in Taoism for thousands of years would not die so easily. But he was only one step away from death, or returning to Hao Yin's divine kingdom. If he could not resist Ning Ke's thousands of cuts, then everything would be over. The Abbey Dean had looked down on the world all his life and had rarely felt the shadow of death. He was defeated by Kohaoren's sword once. He was hit by the headmaster's wooden stick once. But even these 2 times he survived and went further on the path of cultivation. Only the great fear between life and death could give a person like the Abbey Dean a chance to understand Tao. Today he saw the abyss between life and death again in front of Ning Ke's blade. Could he understand something? The Abbey Dean looked at Ning Ke with a very strange expression on his face. It was not indifferent regret nor anger. It had nothing to do with unwillingness. It was not an expression that a human should have. It was extremely calm and showed indifference. The deepest part of the indifference was not coldness but emptiness. There was no emotion. An emotionless expression should not be called an expression. But Ning Ke felt that it was, and he was very vigilant. There was no emotion in the Abbey Dean's eyes, and even his pupils gradually faded. It was not faint like when he used the gray eyes but really faint. The Abbey Dean's eyes were so faint that they were almost transparent. They were no longer jade but tasteless water. Then he suddenly retracted his fingers. Ning Ke's iron cutlass fell down. Before the blade arrived, the wind had already started raging. His black hair danced in the wind and blood scattered in the wind. The flesh that peeled off from his body was as red as flower petals. The ghastly white bones were as clean as lotus roots. The scene that should have been bloody looked extremely beautiful at this moment. He turned into a lotus. The blood could not be stained and the dirt could not cover. It was extremely peaceful. It was extremely peaceful. The broken rainbow floated down from the blue sky and finally landed on the street. Some of them fell on the Abbey Dean, which suddenly glowed with golden jade and then slid off. These rainbow fragments were the remnant aura of Tianqi. But somehow the power given by Hao Yin could not be integrated into the Abbey Dean's flesh and blood. The connection between the Abbey Dean and Hao Yin seemed to be broken. He seemed to have disappeared from heaven and earth, turning into snow and flowers that escaped. He was so independent and so untouchable. Looking at this scene, Yulian suddenly raised her eyebrows. Eldest brother said incredulously, "The state of pureness? The next chapter will be broken, but I don't know when it will be written. Anyway, it will be written. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 807. The state of pureness was said to be the most unfathomable state in Hao Yin Taoism, but no one had ever seen it, not even in the history of cultivation after the last everlasting night. For the real powerhouses in this world, there was one question that they were most curious about: how high was the headmaster of the academy? Master Qishan of the Lank Temple once guessed that the headmaster of the academy should be in the state of pureness. It could be imagined how high the state of pureness was in people's eyes. The headmaster of the academy proved his state in the wilderness, which was beyond everyone's imagination. But even he had never seen anyone enter the state of pureness in his long life. The eldest brother had never seen it either. His understanding of the state of pureness came from the scattered records in the books at the back of the mountain of the academy. It was only a guess that he shouted the words state of pureness. He felt that his guess should not be far from the truth. There was no other way to explain the Abbey Dean's change except for the legendary state of pureness. Ning Ke wrote that character, gathered the desire of thousands of people in Chang and borrowed thousands of knives, and was about to kill the Abbey Dean. But the Abbey Dean actually entered the state of pureness. The eldest brother could not believe that someone in this world could enter this legendary state. But it happened so vividly in front of him. The Abbey Dean was indeed the most powerful powerhouse in Haotian Taoism in 1,000 years, the only one below Haotian. Compared to the other states, the state of pureness was a higher state. It could be called peerless because it could be separated from the world. When one entered the state of pureness, all the power in the world became an absolute foreign object to the cultivator. The clear and beautiful sunlight shone on the cliffs, and the green pine trees cast their shadows on the rocks. If a cool breeze blew, it would shake the pine trees or it would blow away the dust on the rocks, but how could it blow away the shadows? At this time the Abbey Dean's flesh and blood were the lotus petals, and his bones were the lotus joints. He was born in the clear water, not in the world. Ning Ke's iron cutlass was still in the world. How could it fall on him? The iron cutlass could break 3 of the 5 states, but how could it break the state of pureness? The iron cutlass had cut through the quietus, the immeasurable, and the divine demon realm. Ning Ke's fighting will and spirit were at their peak at this moment. The terrifying chi of heaven and earth in his body seemed to be about to burst out. Because he knew he would think and worry. Eldest senior brother was like that now. But he knew nothing. He did not know why the Abbey Dean was floating and why he looked much cleaner. So he did not think. He only knew that he was going to hack him to death. His iron saber finally came down completely. The iron cutlass finally finished writing that character in the blue sky with a flame of more than 10 li. Everything on the Vermilion Bird Avenue was rolled up by his blade wind and attacked the Abbey Dean. There were silver ingots and gold bars from the Yamen storeroom, flowers and birds from the calligraphy and painting shop, powder and a dozen hairpins, and an old incense burner from a small Taoist temple. There were iron pots and broken gongs, overnight tea in a teapot, urine in a chamber pot, half-eaten buns, minced meat with the smell of scallions and feces and urine in the sewers. No matter if it was beautiful or ugly, sweet or stinky, pleasing or disgusting, it was the human world. Ning Ke's cutlass had cut out all the aura of the human world, including the filth. Everything was mixed together and no longer had different properties. It was no longer fragrant or stinky. What was the difference between silver ingots and a chamber pot? What was the difference between feces and gold bars? The Vermilion Bird Avenue was raging and became extremely dark. The entire Chang and became extremely dark and then gradually turned dark. It seemed that the night was coming. On the long street that seemed to be shrouded in darkness, dull sounds of collisions could be heard. The Abbey Dean was like a pure lotus with bright red petals and white stems, swaying in the wind. Countless things from the human world hit his body. Minced meat with the smell of scallions fell on his face and then fell down, leaving some frozen meat juice on his beard and a small piece of scallion. A gold bar hit heavily on his chest, causing the petal-like flesh to tremble slightly. Then a mark was left on the gold bar. It was the mark of the national treasury of the Tang Empire. A chamber pot flew past his right shoulder, spilling disgusting yellow urine. A box of cosmetic powder scattered in front of him, splashing on his snow-white face. The Abbey Dean's body was covered in blood and filth. 2 rotten vegetable leaves hung on his belt, and there were several clusters of feces on the wounds of his broken fingers. He had become very dirty, very dirty. Even if he had not entered the state of pureness, he had never been so dirty in his life. He had lived above the human world and traveled in the South Sea. His feet were not stained by dust, but now he was forced to be baptized by the human world and be contaminated by all the aura of the human world. The filth from the human world was not only outside the body, but also outside the heart. The Abbey Dean was still in the state of pureness, unharmed. As long as he could keep his Taoist heart peaceful, his body and mind would be clean. However, his body and mind were the same. If his body had been contaminated by the human world for a long time, how could his heart remain peaceful? After countless years or even several everlasting nights, the legendary state of pureness finally appeared in the human world again. What a shocking scene it was. However, what was even more shocking was that as soon as the state of pureness reappeared in the human world, it met the most powerful opponent in the world, the human world itself. The lotus swayed in the black wind as if it could wither or die at any time. The Abbey Dean continued to fight against Ning Quebec. No one knew the result of the battle between the peerless state of Taoism and the human world. Even Hao Yin did not know. Zhang Rui was the most famous ruffian in Sanyuanli. He was good at cheating, but he was timid. He was even worse than the most useless ruffians, so even the young people looked down on him. He had no fixed residence and wandered around, so he did not receive any notice from the imperial court. In the early morning, he was awakened by the ringing of bells all over the city, and then he heard many noises in the wind. Zhang Rui did not know that it was the Abbey Dean fighting against the academy. He did not even know what was going on in Chang'an. But when he found that the streets were empty and the government runners of Chang and local government who usually patrolled the streets were nowhere to be seen, his remaining doubts were immediately diluted by ecstasy. He went to the Lotus Pond to steal several bolts of embroidered cloth from the South Jing Kingdom. When he found that a Yaman's warehouse had collapsed, he was about to pick up some silver, but he hesitated because of fear. Although he was a ruffian like other Tangs, he felt that dignity was very important. So when he returned to the small yard, he felt ashamed of his previous cowardice. In order not to feel ashamed, he decided to do something that he had wanted to do for a long time. He took out a sharp knife and sneaked into the yard of Li Zheng's house, ready to stab the big yellow dog that had bitten him when he was young. More than a decade had passed since that incident, and the big yellow dog from back then had already become an old yellow dog. It did not have the power to resist at all, and it died as soon as Ouyang Ming stabbed it with the sharp knife. Zhang Rui even doubted whether the old yellow dog was stabbed to death by himself or died of old age. Anyway, he had accomplished what he wanted to do the most in his life. He carried the old yellow dog back to the small yard and began to peel and cut it into pieces. Then he lit the stove and prepared to cook a pot of dog meat. At this time, he heard a conversation coming from the street. He could not understand the conversation, but then he heard two young people crying. He recognized that one of them should be the cold-eyed boy from the Zhang family. Zhang Rui held the top of the wall with both hands and looked at the street. Then he roughly understood what was happening in Chang'an. He was very scared and hurried back to the yard. He stared blankly at the unboiled water in the pot and the dog meat on the chopping board for a while. He stabbed the sharp knife into the chopping board and poured the bloody dog meat into the pot of water. He pushed down the old and loose wall that had not been repaired for many years, picked up a dozen bricks and held them in his arms. Then, with great difficulty, he climbed up the wall again, took out a brick and threw it at the Taoist priest on the street. He thought it was safer this way. Thinking of the pot of dog meat, he was a little angry and felt sorry for the old yellow dog. So he cursed at the Taoist priest. "I'll smash you to death, son of a bitch." Zhang Rui died just like that. No one would ever know that he had fulfilled the biggest wish of his life today. No one would ever know that half of the wall in the small yard had collapsed and the dog meat was cooking in the pot. The Abbey Dean's quietus will shrouded the whole Chang'an. The firewood in the stove was frozen out and the water in the pot no longer heated up. The dog meat in the water continued to soak like that and a lot of blood came out. Ning Ke pulled out his padao from the snowy street. The sharp knife on the chopping board in the small yard jumped up. The blood on the knife was still fresh. The pot not far away was steaming. A word appeared in the blue sky. A gust of wind blew on the Vermilion Bird Avenue. The world became extremely dark. Chang'an seemed to fall into the night ahead of time. The small yard was also in the dark. The black wind was very violent. It blew everywhere and broke the eaves in the marketplace. The remaining half of the wall in the small yard was also blown down. Even the dog meat pot on the stove was blown up. The dog meat pot was blown over the wall and onto the street. Then it fell on a person. It fell on the Abbey Dean. The pot of bloody dog meat was poured over the Abbey Dean's head. The blood and soup drenched his whole body. The dog meat fell on the Abbey Dean's broken body. If it were a lotus, the warm dog meat would be hanging on the petals. The petals were dripping with blood. The Abbey Dean's body was dirty, and then his heart was dirty. The peace of Taoism was finally broken by the secular world. The Abbey Dean's eyes were filled with confusion. "I'm going to kill you," Ning Ke said. His iron cutlass chopped on the Abbey Dean's left shoulder, his real body. Even though the state of peace was broken, the Abbey Dean's state of divine demon was extremely profound and almost immortal. So he chopped with great force. He bent his left knee slightly. The Haoran Chi was like a storm. Countless chi of heaven and earth poured into the iron cutlass and dragged it down obliquely. It cut a horrible wound on the Abbey Dean's body. The pure lotus was rolled up by the black wind and gradually withered. Then the petals fell. Ning Kei's knife contained the vicissitudes of Chang and for thousands of years and the desire of thousands of people. The Abbey Dean was directly chopped into dust and floated to the south of the long street. Blood spilled along the way. Hundreds of each talismans in the streets of Chang and fell on him again. Thousands of cutlasses in Chang and city chopped on him at the same time. Under the dark night, in the wind of the cutlass, the Abbey Dean's 7 fingers fell like lotus roots. Then his legs left his body. His abdomen split open and his intestines were broken. The dog blood and feces entered the deepest part of his body and could not be washed away. A human-shaped hole appeared on the South City gate with a bang. The Abbey Dean flew out of Chang'an City. He wanted to leave Chang'an City since Ning Kei pulled out his cutlass, but not in this way. The black wind rolled up the Abbey Dean's body and continued to dance. The huge stones in the lake outside the South City gate were blown into a mess. Even the broken stone array tactics could not stop Ning Kei's cutlass wind. There was a lake 4 miles south of the city. The hurricane swept over and the lake water was rolled up like rain. The Abbey Dean's body fell heavily on the lakeside. The clean lake water fell down and washed away some of the filth on his body. A few fishes landed on the ground beside him, struggling with their tails. The hurricane created by Ning Kei's cutlass continued to move south. The lakeside gradually became quiet and the sky became clear. The Abbey Dean opened his eyes and looked at the blue sky. His lips moved slightly as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. He turned his head to look at the fish struggling in the puddle. The fish struggled for a while and finally accepted their fate and died. The Abbey Dean looked at the dead fish and seemed to understand something. The sound of footsteps came from the lakeside. Chin Pippi knelt down in front of him. Finally done. It's inappropriate not to ask for votes at this climax. That's why. Well, I admit it. Yun Kai said today is the Consumer Rights Day and asked me to ask for votes with this reason. I don't know how to object. I'm speechless. Anyway, let's vote if you want. I'm satisfied with this paragraph and I've used all the things I prepared. I'll start to finish the questions tomorrow. It might be updated later and there might only be 1 chapter. Enjoy your reading. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 808. The whole world had been fighting against the Tang Empire for several months. After the Abbey Dean was killed by Ning Kei, many changes had taken place. These changes might have been accidental, but some were inevitable. On the Xiangwan Plain in the north, more than 1,000 Tang soldiers had been fighting for their lives. At the moment when they thought they were going to die, they finally saw the dust from the south and the reinforcement cavalry. The situation of the battle suddenly changed. Thousands of Tang cavalrymen from the northern battlefront army rushed to the cavalry of the Golden Tribe Royal Court like an avalanche. Their cold blades took away countless heads in the silent sun. The battle finally came to an end. The blood-stained meadow turned the light from the sky red. The Padao in situ Elon's hand had long been broken into 2 pieces. She wiped the blood off her face and looked around the battlefield. She found that most of her subordinates had died, but she and her team had finally won. Outside the Verdant Canyon in the south, it was the most dangerous moment. Jun Imo held the iron sword in his hand and looked exhausted. He was like the green mountains in late autumn, quiet and beautiful, but the yellow leaves were falling. The disciples of the back of the mountain of the academy stood behind him. Looking at the dust on the field and listening to the sound of the iron hooves, they were silent and waiting for the last moment. Muyu reached out and held Jun Mo's empty right sleeve. Fan Yu, the 4th brother, had been fighting against the Abbey Dean's virtual sword with the river and mountain sandbox with all his cultivation. At this time, even he struggled to walk out of the iron shelter. Since they were from the same sect, they should live and die together. The cavalry of the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army came to the Verdant Canyon again. During the past 7 days, the disciples of the Academy had defeated the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army many times. Both they and the Divine Hall Coalition Army were tired of this scene. It would be different this time. It would probably be the last time. At this moment, the 4th brother suddenly felt that the river and mountain sandbox in his hand had become much lighter. He sensed it and was shocked to find that the virtual sword could no longer be found in the sandbox. People in front of the Verdant Canyon did not know what had happened in Chang'an. But there was only one possibility, that the Abbey Dean's virtual sword had disappeared. That was, the Abbey Dean was dead or disabled. Fourth brother was well aware of the academy's preparations in Chang'an. He knew that his senior brothers, senior sisters and youngest brother were trying their best to kill the Abbey Dean, but he did not have much hope for it. Because he was good at calculation, he could not figure out how the academy could kill the Abbey Dean no matter how hard he tried. However, at this time, the virtual sword in the river and mountain sandbox disappeared without a trace. Whether he believed it or not, it showed that something must have happened in Chang'an City. He said in a hoarse voice, "The Abbey Dean has lost." His voice was hoarse not only because of the exhaustion he felt after enduring the phantom sword for several days, but also because of his irrepressible excitement and disbelief. Everyone in the academy heard this. Silence reigned. Suddenly Jun Imo raised his iron sword and pointed it at the field, laughing out loud. Beigong Weiyang roared with laughter as he plucked at the strings of his zither. Shimen Buhua laughed out loud and slapped his palms with the flute. The sixth brother gave a simple and honest smile and held the iron hammer in his hand tighter. Wang Qi smiled faintly. The black flowers on his temples seemed to have gained some color. Teak Mu was a woman, so she didn't know how to be heroic. She didn't smile, but her eyes were wet. The cavalrymen of the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army were right in front of them. However, the Academy's disciples did not seem to care. They laughed out loud and were extremely pleased. Their hearty laughter echoed in front of the verdant canyon and spread far away along the Green Mountains. Whether the Abbey Dean was dead or alive, and whether they could defend the verdant canyon or not, as long as Chang'an City was safe and sound, the Academy and the Tang Empire could keep the last hope. They had guarded the verdant canyon for 7 days with their lives. Wasn't it for the hope? And the hope was not lost. It was in their hands. To be more precise, it was in the hands of the fourth brother. Under the puzzled gaze of his fellow disciples, the fourth brother walked to the forefront. Looking at the cavalrymen coming like iron streams and the sword light looming in the air, he raised the river and mountain sandbox. The fourth brother's face became extremely pale, and his cheeks became much thinner. He poured all his psyche power into the river and mountain sandbox. The river and mountain sandbox was a sand table, which contained the finest yellow sand. There were rivers and mountains in the sandbox, and each grain of sand was a peak and a stone bridge in the great rivers and mountains. The yellow sand danced wildly in front of the verdant canyon. The sky was covered and the field became extremely dark. The cavalrymen of the divine halls of West Hill rushed into the yellow sand, and then got lost. From time to time, there were shrill screams and the sound of heavy objects hitting each other. After a long time the yellow sand gradually fell. The verdant canyon returned to peace, and there were many corpses of cavalrymen and horses in the field. The river and mountain sandbox could not change the fate of the disciples of the Academy. Because the Divine Hall Coalition Army was ready to charge again after a little reorganization. At this moment, a soldier of the Tang Empire suddenly walked out of the vast mountains. The soldier looked very embarrassed. His hair was unkempt and his face was dirty, and he was covered with mud. His armor had been thrown into the mountain stream, and his clothes were cut into strips by the thorns in the mountains. The soldier ran to the people of the Academy. He staggered all the way and almost fell several times. It could be seen that he was extremely tired, but he still ran and shouted. His voice was extremely hoarse, as if he had not drunk water for many days. But in the ears of the people of the Academy, it was as clear as the clearest spring water. Wang Wu of Group B of the Scout Battalion of the Southern Army is here to help. After saying this, the soldier of the Southern Army who had arrived at the verdant canyon first, could no longer support himself and fell heavily on the field. He kept panting and could no longer stand up. Wang Qi walked to the Tang soldier's side and quickly felt his pulse. Jun Imo solemnly bowed to the most ordinary soldier of the Tang and said, "Thank you." An ordinary scout of the Tang army could not play any role in the situation in front of the verdant canyon. For the people of the Academy, the arrival of the Tang soldier meant a lot of things. The Academy was the Academy of the Tang Empire. The Tang Empire was the Tang Empire of the Academy. No one was fighting alone. Then, another soldier of the Tang Empire came out of the mountains. Then, more soldiers walked out of the mountains and came to the field. They supported each other and cheered for their companions. They were already exhausted. When they walked out of the verdant canyon, they sat down on the ground and could no longer stand up. Even if they picked up their weapons, they could not fight the enemy. There were even a few soldiers who suddenly relaxed and fell to the ground the moment they walked out of the mountains. For the well-trained soldiers of the Tang Empire, this was unimaginable. More and more soldiers continued to walk out of the mountains and came to the verdant canyon. After walking for several days and nights without rest, they finally reached this place. The Southern Army had arrived. That was enough. It was a tired army that appeared in front of the verdant canyon. But no one dared to deny that they were a mighty army. At this moment, the sound of gongs came from the field in the south. The cavalrymen of the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army looked at the Tang army in front of the verdant canyon with complicated expressions. Some were unwilling, some were in awe. Finally, they pulled the border ropes and returned to the camp. I was too high yesterday when I poured dog's blood on the Abbey Dean, so I am in low spirits today. Plus, I reported in advance yesterday that I have some family affairs to deal with, so I only have one chapter. But it is not appropriate to write less than 2,000 words. So I will write 7,000 words on Sunday. Have a good weekend. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 809. The black wind caused by Ning Kei's blade had blown across the long street and cut the Abbey Dean black and blue all over. The Abbey Dean had fallen to the lakeside like a dead fish, but it did not stop there. Instead, it continued to head south. 2,000 elite cavalrymen were dozens of miles south of the city. They did not know what had happened in Chang'an and were still dreaming of killing and looting after entering the city. Only a few people in the West Hill Divine Palace knew the Abbey Dean's overall plan, but Long Qing was one of them. In a sense, he was the Abbey Dean's last disciple at the South Sea. Long Qing thought that he knew what was happening in Chang'an. He had come all the way here at all costs just to cooperate with the Abbey Dean. The Abbey Dean should have defeated the Academy and broken the God-stunning array. Without any official army to protect Chang'an was a sinner waiting for death in front of his 2,000 cavalrymen. Thinking of this, Long Qing could not help but feel happy. His cavalry would be the first army to attack Chang'an in history, and it would also be the last army to destroy Chang'an. He was the prince of the Yin Kingdom and the divine son of West Hill. It was his lifelong wish to destroy Chang'an and the Tang Empire. In order to achieve this wish, he had put in too much effort. Even his soul had been tested by ice and fire countless times. He had long been covered with cuts and bruises. For him, there was one more thing he had to accomplish while destroying Chang'an: to kill Ning Kei, an opponent who had left too many cruel memories in his life. In the Green Mountains behind the Jishou Abbey, he had used the gray eyes to devour the Halfman Taoist's lifetime cultivation. In the wilderness, he had also devoured the spiritual power of many priests of the palace. Now he had forcibly raised his state to the peak of the knowing destiny state. Although he knew that Ning Kei had also entered the knowing destiny state, he firmly believed that he would definitely win this time. From the banquet in Chang'an to the stone path in the back of the mountain of the Academy, to the arrow on the snow cliff in the wilderness, and to the autumn rain outside the Red Lotus Temple, he had lost to Ning Kei too many times. What made him most angry was that Ning Kei was clearly inferior to him in all aspects, but he still lost again and again. If fate really existed in the world, and if Haoyan really looked down on the human world calmly and lovingly, then after so many inexplicable defeats, it should be his turn to win. The more he paid, the sweeter the fruit he harvested. Looking at the looming city in the north, Long Qing thought of the scene when he entered the city and the scene of Ning Kei falling painfully under his sword. He suddenly felt that all the pain he had suffered in the past few years had turned into an intoxicating fragrance. The houses on the side of the road collapsed in the raging fire, and the flames danced on the silver mask. His eyes, which were exposed outside the mask, were calm as usual, but the hand holding the reins trembled slightly. At this moment, the raging fire in the village suddenly extinguished. Long Qing looked at the village that had suddenly become extremely quiet. He looked at the scorched earth and ruins that were emitting black smoke and looked at the quiet field. He raised his eyebrows slightly, and an extremely strange feeling arose in his heart. Even the most violent rain could not extinguish such a huge fire in such a short time. Even the most violent wind could not blow out all the flames in the village. Moreover, the dark clouds in the sky dispersed, revealing the clear blue sky. There was no trace of rain. The field on both sides of the official road was unusually quiet, and there was not even a trace of wind. What on earth happened? The surrounding cavalrymen also noticed this strange scene, and they looked around in confusion. Long Qing did not look in any other direction, but just stared at the other end of the official road. This straight and spacious official road led directly to Chang'an City, and it was the Vermilion Bird School. He could vaguely see a black sandstorm whistling over from afar. Long Qing did not know what the black wind was, but his heart subconsciously beat faster. His Taoist heart shook slightly and endless fear arose in him. He just wanted to run away. Disperse. Avoid the wind. Long Qing's face was slightly pale, and he sternly shouted to the 2,000 cavalrymen scattered around. Then he lifted the reins and wanted to gallop down the official road to the scorched ruins of the village. These 2,000 cavalrymen were a mix of the papal cavalrymen of the Divine Hall and the Lieutenant Palace's direct cavalry. They were Long Qing's most loyal and elite subordinates. They were well-trained and disciplined. Although the cavalrymen did not know what had happened, and they did not see the black wind in the distance, they did not hesitate to lift the reins and kick the horses when they heard Long Qing's stern command. They desperately scattered to the fields on both sides of the official road. As a powerhouse at the peak of knowing destiny state, Long Qing's sense of danger was very accurate and timely. The 2,000 cavalrymen also perfectly demonstrated their mobility and made the fastest response. However, the black wind from Chang'an City had already gone beyond the scope of the human world, and it could not even be described with speed. In an instant, it rushed more than 10 miles and came to the front of Long Qing and the cavalrymen. Wind was the flow of air. Air itself had no color, so the wind in the human world had always been colorless. The reason why the raging wind was black was that it was mixed with many things. Mud, dirty snow, teapot leftovers, iron pots and bricks were all in this violent wind. The clear light from the sky could not fall on the ground, so it looked so dim. What was truly terrifying was that apart from the hard objects in the black wind, there were also countless saber intents hidden in it. These saber intents were so sharp that even the whistling sound of the wind seemed to be cut into countless pieces by them. Some cavalrymen, who did not have time to rush into the field and were still on the official road, were the first to encounter the black wind. They screamed in horror and then suddenly stopped shouting. Their bodies were cut into countless pieces, and their mounts were also cut into countless pieces at the same time, and then were rolled up by the wind. Those cavalrymen who scattered to the field did not avoid the edge of the black wind. Even if they dismounted and hid behind the broken wall was cut and then they were cut. They hid behind the mound and then the mound was overturned by the wind, and then they were also rolled up by the wind and no one knew where they went. The black wind came as if it was the deepest and darkest night. In the thick darkness, only the sound of countless knives cutting through the air could be heard, but no one wielding the knives could be seen. The cavalrymen screamed in despair and then died one after another. Long Qing looked at the houses in front of him that were cut into countless pieces by the wind, and his face turned slightly pale. At this moment, the black wind was already in front of him, and he finally saw some details in the wind. He saw the utensils of the ordinary people in Chang'an City, and then he saw the knife marks. He knew who wielded these knives. With a clear roar, he took out the dark and quiet peach blossom from his chest, and faced the black wind. This was his natal peach blossom, and he did not hesitate to use his lifelong cultivation. However, even though the Abbey Dean had comprehended the state of pureness between life and death, and turned white bones and flesh into white stems and red lotuses, he was still cut by the black wind, and no one knew whether he was dead or alive, let alone him. The black peach blossom withered at a speed visible to the naked eye, and then its petals fell off. Countless tiny wounds appeared on Long Qing's body. The silver mask on his face cracked like a dry field and then peeled off. After a long time, the black wind finally stopped, and no one knew where the black wind went. Did it disappear or broke the void and entered another space? The fields in the south of the city returned to peace, but what fell first was not the clear light, but a terrible rain of blood. To be more precise, it was a storm of flesh and blood. The cavalrymen and war horses that were cut into pieces by the knife intent flew up with the black wind, and then fell on the ground one after another until the black wind disappeared. Tens of thousands of pieces of flesh and blood fell on the state highway and the fields, making muffled sounds and splashing blood and terrifying juices. The 2,000 cavalrymen that attacked Chang'an City all died in the black wind. Most of them were turned into pieces of flesh and blood, and some were directly swept up into the sky and then fell to their deaths. The branches on the southeast side of the state highway were full of pieces of flesh and corpses. A dozen black crows flew over and circled the trees, cawing cheerfully, ready to welcome the grand banquet. These black crows could not have eaten all the pieces of flesh and blood, so there must be a lot left. The cavalrymen had burned the village, and the Taoist willow had also turned into charred branches. It must have been nourished by their flesh and blood, and in a few years, the willow trees here must have grown very beautiful. Long Qing was still alive. He looked at Chang'an City in the distance. The silver mask was broken and the old wounds were not gone. There were many new wounds on his face, and his once perfect face was now very horrible, like the ghost corpse in the underworld. He suddenly laughed and then burst into tears. For the city to kill the person in the city, He had paid a very painful price, and was even willing to sacrifice his soul. However, when he was about to succeed, he found that it was still a wishful thinking. The city looked so close, but it turned out to be so far away. He had not even seen Ning Ke, but he was defeated, and his flesh and blood were all over the ground. What made him feel the most painful was that Ning Ke's knife did not cut him, and he believed that Ning Ke did not even know that he had been to Chang'an City and was once so close to it. But he was still defeated. He looked at Chang'an City in the distance and let out a desperate cry. Ning Ke. Ever since they entered the second floor of the academy, there were busybodies in the world who described Ning Ke and Prince Longqing as lifelong enemies. But Ning Ke really did not know that Longqing was in the south of Chang'an City. He also did not know that Longqing had been driven crazy by the Black Wind, and that the 2,000 elite cavalrymen who were supposed to bring disaster to Chang'an City had been cut into a rain of flesh and blood by the knife style in the wind. He had cut the Abbey Dean. The Abbey Dean was also the one that tens of millions of Tangs in Chang'an City wanted to cut. He had cut, and the Black Wind had brought darkness to the human world, and the Abbey Dean had been sent flying. It was quiet on the Vermilion Bird Avenue. Whether injured or not, everyone was looking at Ning Ke's back. It was Old Chow who finally broke the silence. Old Chow asked in a trembling voice, "Is he dead?" The people on the street were all brave, but no one wanted to face such a horrible person like the Abbey Dean again. Ning Ke shook his head. Everyone was silent. Ning Ke said, "But even if he is not dead, he will be disabled." Hearing his words, no one could react for a while. Zhang Nianzhu and Li Guangdi leaned against the wet wall, and looked at each other in confusion. Old Chow was startled and scolded with a smile, "You are still teasing me at this time?" He walked toward the eastern city with the help of his walking stick, and shouted, "Everything is over, what are you waiting for? Go home and find your mother. Who's coming? Go to the Imperial Physician Bureau and call for help." Old Mrs. Chu laughed heartily, and handed the old knife to her youngest daughter-in-law behind her. It was not until then that people finally confirmed the outcome of the battle. Zhang Nianzhu and Li Guangdi looked at each other and smiled. The tea maker laughed. Everyone burst into laughter. They all laughed out loud. The cheerful laughter gradually spread. Laughter rang out in every street and alley in Chang'an City. Yu Lian carried eldest brother and walked to the side of the street. Eldest brother had been chasing the Abbey Dean for 7 days, and his psyche power had long been exhausted. Today in Chang'an City, they had been fighting from morning till now, from the street to the sky, and he had been seriously injured, and no one knew how many bones in his body had been broken. "Eldest brother, I didn't feel that you were so tall when we were at the back of the mountain." Yu Lian looked at eldest brother's toes that were almost touching the snow, and said with a slight frown. She frowned because she was confused and also because of the pain. She jumped up to the sky and then fell from the sky and still had to carry eldest brother. Although she was the Grandmaster of the Devil's Doctrine, she was also seriously injured and could not bear the pain. Blood came out from her slender ankle, and the bones in her flesh were broken into pieces. Every step she took, bones pierced into her flesh, bringing endless pain. Yu Lian stopped in the middle of the street, and tiny beads of sweat appeared on her forehead. Eldest brother landed on the ground, carried her in his arms, and walked to the side of the street and kept coughing blood. Finally, they walked to the side of the street with difficulty, and eldest brother put her down. He looked at her and explained in a slow and serious tone, "Younger sister, it's not that I have become taller, but that you have become shorter." Yu Lian responded with a hum. The two sat side by side on the broken doorsill. Eldest brother looked across the street and waved his hand. Mo Shanshan did not see it because she was looking at the street. On the street, Ning Ke looked up at the sky and said, "Teacher, do you see it?" After a moment he said again, "Sang Sang, do you see it?" Ning Ke slowly sat down. Countless sounds of knives were heard in Chang'an City. That was the sound of swords returning to their sheaths. Countless sounds of air breaking came from his body. That was the sound of returning to the array. Countless chi of heaven and earth surged out from his body, and returned to the streets and alleys of Chang'an City. He began to bleed, and the blood was instantly shaken into mist, and there were countless thunder and lightning in the mist. One moment it was destroyed and the next moment it was reborn. Mo Shanshan walked to his side and helped him up. They also sat on the broken doorsill. The 4 people sitting on the doorsill did not speak and just looked at the sky quietly. It was as if there was a beautiful picture in the sky. There was no picture in the sky. There were only 2 traces of water vapor left by the flame that was shot out by the iron cutlass. The water vapor was the cloud. It was a word written by the cloud. It was a big word person. After a long time the word gradually disappeared. It was as if it had never appeared. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 8:10. The winter was getting colder and colder and the wind was like a knife. As the tension eased, the refugees who had been transferred to Chang'an had all returned to their homes. The people living in the south of the city were cleaning up the villages that had been burned by the enemy in the bitter cold. More than 100 Tang soldiers were walking along the official road. Judging from their armors and weapons, they should be the ordinary prefectural army of a certain state. The people who were busy rebuilding their homes saw the tired soldiers and put down the tools in their hands to cheer them up. Someone shouted, "We're almost at Chang'an." The Tang army nodded and continued to move forward. The applause by the roadside soon subsided. The imperial court could not increase the relief efforts. They had to rely on their own hands to survive the cold winter. The villagers had to hurry up and at least build houses that could withstand the wind. There were a few carriages behind the Tang army. The villagers who were busy working thought that the people in the carriages might be officials from some southern state, so they had no time to care about them. They did not know that, in a sense, it was the people in the carriages who had saved the Tang Empire. The sunlight shone through the gap of the window and fell on Junmo's face. He had not recovered from his serious injury and his thin cheeks were extremely pale. Under the winter sunshine, his face looked like clean snow. He looked at the scorched village outside the window and remained silent. No one knew what he was thinking. Muyu looked at his profile and her eyebrows were full of worry. The disciples of the back of the mountain of the academy were all seriously injured in the Battle of the Verdant Canyon. She was in the best condition. She had used up too much psyche power to maintain the tactical array. After resting for a few days she had mostly recovered. Fourth brother and the others were in a much worse condition. They could not get up after receiving treatment and had been resting in the carriages behind. No one knew when they would really recover. But she was most worried about Junmo because he was the most seriously injured. Junmo had woken up after leaving the Verdant Canyon. He seemed to be fine but she was very worried. Because he had been silent for too long during the journey. He had been sitting quietly by the window, looking at the snow-covered fields in the south of the Tang Empire and the villages that had been burned by the enemy. Muyu looked at his determined profile and his scattered hair. Then she looked at his empty sleeve and sighed silently in her heart. Those carriages did not enter Chang'an City, but directly went to the academy. The Tang army in charge of escorting them left when they reached the meadow. The meadow was covered with a thin layer of snow. There were countless peach blossoms in the snow, but it was not the season for them to blossom yet. The academy was very quiet today, even a little deserted. No members of the royal family or ministers bowed humbly, no people lined the streets to welcome them, no grand ceremony, no loud gongs and drums, and not many people came to welcome them. No one cared about this because they did not inform the people in Chang'an. They would go out to battle and then come back. Returning to the academy was the same as going home. There were only two people waiting for them on the meadow, the cute little attendant, Su Jialuan, and Ning Ke, who was holding a walking stick and covered in bandages. Looking at Junmo, the little attendant shed 2 lines of tears without saying a word. Junmo had left him in the academy and he had been living in fear for so many days. Today he had finally seen his young master come back alive. How could he control his emotions? When he saw that Junmo's right arm was broken, he immediately burst into tears. Junmo frowned slightly and said, "Don't cry." The little attendant was obedient and desperately wiped his tears. However, there were too many tears and he could not wipe them clean. When he saw Junmo's hair he could not help but cry out, "Young master, how did your hair turn white?" Ning Ke looked at second brother's empty sleeves and gray hair, and did not know what to say. Junmo said expressionlessly, "There are burning villages everywhere, and there is too much dust on the road." It was a very clumsy and even cute explanation but no one laughed. It was quiet in the carriage. "Why is the academy so quiet?" second brother asked. Ning Ke said, "Third sister dismissed instructors and students in the front yard of the academy in advance. Some instructors and students have left, but most of them are working for the imperial court in Chang'an City, and some have gone to the front line." Junmo asked, "How are senior brother and Yu Lian now?" Ning Ke said, "They are fine, but it is a little inconvenient for them to move." The carriage drove through the dilapidated stone gate of the academy and went deeper. The teaching building and the front hall of the second floor of the academy were all ruined, especially the lane leading to the old library and the back of the mountain. It was impossible to find anyone to repair it. Junimo looked at the scene in silence. The back of the mountain of the academy was still warm as spring. The little attendant and Tang Xiaotang carried the teachers to the soft beds in the thatched hut that could not be destroyed by the autumn wind. Some were still unconscious and some were barely supporting themselves. They could not hear Beigong's flute, Shimon's zither, Song Qian and Eighth Brother's quarrel over a chess piece for the time being. They would probably never see their teacher again. Eldest brother and Yu Lian were sitting in the wheelchair. Junimo let go of Mu Yu's hand, walked to the wheelchair of eldest brother and bowed to him. Then he looked at Yu Lian and said, Xiong Chimo deserves to die. Why didn't you kill him? Yu Lian said calmly, some people are more useful alive than dead. Second brother thought for a while and did not continue to ask. Eldest brother looked at his empty sleeves and gray hair and said, Teacher once said that we should learn to accept some things since we can't change them. I don't care but I feel regret. Junimo looked at the gray sky outside the hut and said, I always wanted to be like youngest uncle, drawing his sword and fighting against the heavens. When Master ascended to the sky by the Sisui River, I thought that one day, I would be able to follow Master's footsteps. But now it seems that there is no chance. Not everyone could understand what he was saying. Eldest brother sighed and brought up another matter. Pippi has left. In the back of the mountain, Junimo and Chin Pippi were the closest. Hearing the news, he kept silent for a while and then asked, Can the Abbey Dean recover? It was the most important question for the academy. Junimo looked at Ning Ke when he asked the question. Everyone in the hut who was awake was looking at Ning Quebec. That day on the Vermilion Bird Avenue, Ning Ke had given an answer to the people in Chang'an. But today he still thought for a long time and then said with certainty, no. Hearing this answer, second senior brother's cold expression finally relaxed a little. Even the wind that blew into the thatched cottage seemed to have become a little warmer. The state that the Abbey Dean had shown was the coldest cloud in the heart of the people in the back of the mountain. Although he was defeated in Chang'an, he was not defeated by Ning Ke, but by the God-stunning array. In other words, he was still defeated by the headmaster of the academy. If it were not in Chang'an but in another place in the human world, no matter eldest brother, Junimo or even Yu Lian, they would not be able to defeat the Abbey Dean. As for Ning Ke, it was even more impossible. The sound of the waterfall reverberated in the courtyard. It was deafening. Ning Ke had never understood how second brother could fall asleep in such an environment. He also could not understand how senior brothers and sisters could hear each other's voices when they were discussing in the courtyard. He once asked second brother this question and second brother's answer was, you will get used to it after a long time. As long as your heart is calm, no sound can disturb your ears. Dozens of days later, Junimo returned to his courtyard after 7 days and 7 nights of unimaginable fighting in front of the Verdant Canyon and 2 dazzling battles between powerhouses. For the first time he felt that the sound of the waterfall was a little noisy. He knew that it was because his heart was not calm enough. It was already dark. He stood by the window and looked at the night sky above the mountain. He was silent for a long time, and then he looked at his empty sleeve and frowned slightly. He had lost his right arm in the battle with Liu Bai. The disability of the body was not a problem. Junimo could still sweep the world with the iron sword in his left hand. The problem was the disability of the mind. The body and the mind had always been 2 sides of the same coin. He was very clear that he would probably never reach the end of the cultivation path in this life. The end of the cultivation path was the Great Way. The other side of the river was the other side. It was not above the 5 states but a higher place. It was a place that only youngest uncle and the headmaster of the academy could reach. It was above the sky. In terms of sword Taoism, he was only slightly inferior to Liu Bai. But he was younger and had more potential, so he had more hope of reaching that place. Now these hopes had been lost. For cultivators, this was the heaviest blow. It was even more terrible than death. It made people crazy. Even someone as strong as Junimo gradually turned black. But if someone asked him if it was all worth it, he would still disdain to answer. Because he did not see the water of the yellow river coming from the sky. Because the mountain saw how charming he was. The falling water could not rise again, and the collapsing mountain could not rise again. Regret had nothing to do with the proud second brother. How could it not be worth it to fight with Liu Bai to his heart's content? It was just a little regretful. If we can't fight with heaven, it's actually very interesting to fight with people. Ning Ke walked into the small courtyard. He looked at the lonely back of second brother and said, although the Abbey Dean is disabled, eldest brother and third sister are also seriously injured. They can't be seen and can't recover in a short time. Both the Tang Empire and the Academy need you now. Junimo did not turn around and said, "Don't worry about me." Ning Ke said, "I can't not worry." Junimo turned around and looked at him with a smile. He said, "It's just a little regret. Don't think about it." Ning Ke suddenly felt that he did not know this man standing in front of him. It was as if some subtle changes had happened to him. It was not because second brother did not wear a crown or a bun, nor was it because he showed a rare smile. He was still the proudest person in the world, but he did not have the aura that made people stay away from him. This change made Ning Ke a little uncomfortable and he did not know what to say. Junimo said, "I'm just not used to it. When I put my hands behind my back, my left hand can no longer hold my right hand, and I can't salute anymore. The most important thing is that my posture is not good." 2 chapters with 7,000 words are completed. 2 chapters will be written tomorrow. Please vote for me on Monday and report to me. I will try to finish this volume in 4 days. I have been thinking about the outline of the next volume these 2 days, so I don't have enough brain power. I read the 4th volume, The Year of the Curtain, again and found that it is really good. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 8:11. While they were talking, Muyu walked into the room from the backyard with a basin of hot water. She was surprised to see Ning Ke, but she didn't say anything and began to help second brother dress up. "I can't comb my hair or wear a crown," Junimo said. Ning Ke said, "You don't need to do it yourself since Seven Sister is here." Junimo said, "Men and women should be different. Some things are not convenient." Ning Ke smiled and said, "Everything will be convenient after we get married." It was quiet. The sound of the waterfall falling into the pond was very clear. Muyu lowered her head and was a little shy. Junimo coughed and asked seriously, "What else do you want?" Ning Ke was feeling the atmosphere in the room. When he heard this, he held back his laughter and said, "I do need your help." Junimo said, "Besides eldest brother and Yu Lian, you are the only one who can see my problem. It means your state is quite good. Although it is not stable, you don't need to worry too much. It's not about that." Ning Ke clapped his hands and shouted to the courtyard door outside the window, "Come in." 2 youths with crutches walked in from outside the small courtyard. Both of them looked very nervous, but if one looked closely, they would be able to see that there was actually a huge difference between them. One of the youths was well dressed. He was obviously very nervous, but he still looked around out of the corner of his eyes, pretending to be calm. There was a kind of stinginess in his eyes. The other youth in plain clothes was looking at his feet. His right hand, which was holding the crutch, kept trembling. If it wasn't for the youth in front of him leading him, he probably wouldn't even be able to walk. Ning Ke said to second brother, "In the battle with the Abbey Dean a few days ago, these 2 boys performed well. Judging from their recovery, their bodies are also good. I just don't know if they have potential." "Do you want them to enter the academy?" Junimo asked. Ning Ke said, "If you think they are good enough, you can choose one as your disciple and give the other one to me. But these days you may need to teach them. I don't have time." Junimo said, "You don't have a disciple yet?" Ning Ke said, "If eldest brother wants it, I'll give it to him." The 2 teenagers were Zhang San and Li Si. After the bloody battle on the snow street, they were taught a good lesson. If they had not been seriously injured, they would have been beaten by the elders. Because of their injuries, Li Si and his family did not return to their hometown but lived in the Zhang family's house in Sanyuanli. Today the Chang and local government suddenly sent someone to take them from Chang and to the academy. The 2 youths had no idea what had happened. They walked into the academy in a daze and entered the clouds halfway up the mountain. Then they arrived at the real academy. For the Tangs, the academy was the most honorable place, but it was not mysterious. However, the back mountain was a completely different world because all the details indicated that it should be a fairyland. It was not until they entered the small courtyard accompanied by the sound of the waterfall and heard the conversation between Ning Ke and Junimo that the 2 teenagers realized what kind of lucky chance they had encountered. So they became more and more nervous. Even Zhang Yanzu did not dare to look around. He looked down at his toes and prayed silently in his heart. Ning Ke said, "I know there is a test to enter the back mountain, but I really like these 2 boys. Now I'm worried that they have no aptitude for cultivation like I did in the past." Junimo said, "Since you can cultivate, so can they. As long as the academy is willing to teach people, there is no one that cannot be taught. If you want them to stay, then stay." Ning Ke did not stay any longer. He said a few words to the two teenagers and left. Seventh sister sent him out of the hospital. At the gate of the courtyard she met someone who was talking. The two teenagers were in extreme shock and happiness and did not notice Ning Kei's departure. They looked at the one-armed man in front of them in awe and waited for his instructions. At this moment, a big white goose walked into the small courtyard, shaking its butt. It came to the front of the house with familiarity and clumsily stepped over the high threshold. It walked to Jun Mo's feet and sat down, closing its eyes to rest. It was injured when the hierarch broke into the mountain and had not yet recovered. It was a little listless. Otherwise, if it saw two strangers in its own yard, who knew what would happen? Even so, the two teenagers were still shocked by the big white goose that seemed to know how to behave. When you learn the rules of the academy in the future, the first thing you have to learn is to be calm in the face of danger. Junimo looked at the two teenagers and said expressionlessly, "Go to the yard and stand. You are not allowed to use crutches. You are not allowed to bend your knees and close your eyes. If you can see the first ray of sunlight tomorrow morning, you will pass." Colliding with the big white goose at the gate of the small courtyard, Ning Kei was almost pecked by it. If it were not for the fact that it was not in good spirits, he would definitely not let it go. He said angrily, "Senior sister, when you become the owner of this small courtyard in the future, you can't be like senior brother, who is so strict with Jia Luan and spoils the big white goose. You have to control that animal more. Can't you see that I am also a disabled person now? How dare it bite me?" Mi was a little nervous. Hearing his words, she did not know what to say. She asked in a low voice, "Did you already know about this?" Ning Kei said with a smile, "We are not blind." Muyu twisted the embroidered handkerchief in her hand into a flower and explained in a low voice, "It was he who liked me first." Ning Kei said, "The headmaster is not here. Who dares to care about this?" Muyu said cautiously, "Even if the headmaster is still here, he won't disagree, right?" Ning Kei looked at the bright moon in the night sky and somehow felt a little annoyed. He said, "Who knows what nonsense that old guy will come up with?" "What do you mean by nonsense?" "That is, pulling the little calf. Why would the headmaster do such a thing?" "Because he is close to the old yellow calf." "Younger brother, you are talking nonsense again. Anyway, the headmaster is not reliable." "Well, the headmaster has never been reliable." Muyu looked at the bright moon in the mountains and smiled. Then she turned to Ning Kei and bowed, "Younger brother, thank you." Ning Kei brought the two teenagers to the academy to be apprenticed to the headmaster. No matter what the reason was, he let second brother handle this matter because he wanted to distract senior brother. That was what she thanked him for. Ning Kei smiled and did not say anything more. The back of the mountain was very big. Everyone had their own small courtyard, and it was either a mountain or a lake. Even Tang Xiaotang was no exception. Song Qian and the eighth brother played chess under the pine tree all day long. The scholars lived in the library cave all year round. Basically, no one lived in their small courtyard and it was empty. In the past, because of Sang Sang, Ning Kei was the only non-resident student in the back mountain of the academy. Basically, he lived in the old brush pen shop or Yanming Lake. Occasionally he would stay overnight in the mountain, but he always kept his house. The night was dark and foggy. He walked slowly along the mountain path with the help of his walking stick to his small courtyard. Sang Sang was not in Chang'an. The house at Yanming Lake had been destroyed by him, and the wall of the old brush pen shop had also been cut into two. He had no reason to return to Chang'an, so he would probably make this place his home in the future. His small courtyard was not far from the Mirror Lake. It was behind the dense forest where senior brother Beigong and senior brother Shimin usually played the zither. It was very secluded and quiet. The moonlight fell on the eaves and made it even colder. Someone was waiting for him. Tang Xiaotang leaned against the mud wall and lowered her head. She looked at her old leather boots and kicked the wall from time to time. Ning Kei looked at her beautiful face and the faint sadness between her eyebrows. He said, "Ask whatever you want." Tang Xiaotang looked up at him and asked, "Is Sang Sang really dead?" She was Sang Sang's good friend and Sang Sang had very few good friends. Thinking of this fact, Ning Kei suddenly felt some pain in his body. After coming back, not many people would mention Sang Sang in front of me. Some people probably felt it was not convenient to mention her, such as senior brother and senior sister. Most people have completely forgotten her. Without waiting for Tang Xiaotang to speak, he continued, "Yes, Sang Sang is dead." His tone was very calm, as if he was describing a very ordinary thing. But the more it was so, the sadder it was. Tang Xiaotang said, "She is really Hao Yan's daughter?" Ning Kei was silent for a moment and said, "Or she is Hao Yan?" He thought of the traces left by Hao Yin in the god-stunning array, the traces of Sang Sang in Chang'an, and the old residence and past that he had cut off. He suddenly laughed and said, I raised Hao Yin and even slept with her. Don't you think I am a very legendary person? Tang Xiaodang suddenly felt that he was very pitiful, but she did not know how to comfort him, because she was also a very pitiful person now. Ning Ke looked at her and said, I know what you want to ask. Pippi left Chang'an with the Abbey Dean on his back. He should be going back to the Jishou Abbey. I want to tell you that I owe him a lot and I also owe him my life. So if there is anything you need me to do in the future, I will risk my life to do it. Tang Xiaodang understood what he meant and said, Youngest uncle, thank you very much. The two hugged in the cold moonlight, giving each other warmth and courage, and then said goodbye. Ning Ke used to think that he owed nothing but the world owed him. It was not until he went to the city of Wei, came to Chang'an, and entered the academy that he found that he owed more and more. He owed Qin Pippi his life, and he owed Mo Shanshan a favor. Mo Shanshan did not accept the eldest brother's invitation to live in the academy. She still stayed in the hotel in Chang'an. She came all the way from the Great River Kingdom and left the sect for the academy, the red walls and the white snow. Ning Ke did not know how to face it. He did not know what would happen to lovers in the end. Not all men and women would be like second brother and seventh sister. Just like he once had a wife, but now he tossed and turned on the bed alone. He thought that all these things would probably pass after a good sleep, but he could not fall asleep no matter how hard he tried. He opened his eyes and looked at the white moonlight outside the window. That year when he left the city of Wei, the starlight was also as cold and white as frost. The wound left by the Abbey Dean on his body suddenly became very painful, and so did his heart. Try to finish the next chapter before midnight. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.